The pre-dawn air of Riverside, Connecticut carried that particular November cold that settled into bones and stayed there, a damp chill that no amount of layering could quite defeat. At 4:47 in the morning, the streetlights along Maple Avenue still burned their sodium orange glow, casting long shadows across empty sidewalks where frost had begun to crystallize in delicate temporary patterns that would be gone by the time most people woke. Margaret Sullivan stood at the bus stop on the corner of Maple and 3rd, her breath forming small clouds in the darkness. She wore David's old Columbia windbreaker, navy blue, faded to a softer shade after 15 years of wear, the cuffs frayed but still functional. Beneath it layers, a cardigan from Goodwill, a turtleneck she'd owned since the 90s, thermal leggings under her work pants. The arthritis in her hands had been particularly cruel this morning, each finger joint throbbing with that deep, grinding ache that felt like someone had replaced her knuckles with ground glass. She flexed her fingers slowly inside her gloves, cheap acrylic ones from the dollar store, not the wool-lined leather she used to wear, and felt that familiar catch, that resistance her body now offered against even the simplest movements. Ironic, she thought, not for the first time. 35 years of paperwork, of typing and filing and organizing documents with precision that would make a jeweler weep, and now her hands were betraying her. As if her body had decided that since David was gone, since the work was done, it could finally stop pretending to be strong. The number 47 bus wheezed to a stop, its brakes hissing in the cold air. Margaret climbed aboard, tapping her senior pass against the reader. Another small humiliation, that yellow card that marked her as old, as discounted, as less. She found her usual seat, 3rd row back on the right, where she could watch the world wake up through the scratched window. Riverside passed by in the blue-black of almost morning. The closed storefronts of Main Street, the darkened windows of the library where she'd spent so many Saturday mornings with David, back when Saturdays meant something other than another shift. The diner where he'd proposed, still there, still unchanged, still serving the same terrible coffee they'd laughed about on that day 40 years ago. The elementary school where she'd volunteered before everything. The bus carried her toward Riverside General Hospital, that squat brick building that had been modern in 1987 and was now just old. She got off 2 stops early, not for the exercise, though that's what she told anyone who asked, but because those extra 6 minutes of walking meant she didn't have to stand in the employee entrance with the nurses and doctors, didn't have to feel the weight of their polite smiles that said, "Oh, you're still here." The hospital cafeteria was in the basement, accessible through a side entrance that smelled perpetually of industrial cleaning solution and whatever soup was on special. Margaret pushed through the heavy metal door at 5:23 a.m., exactly on time. Never late, never early. Consistency was a virtue she'd learned from her mother, one of the few things besides stubbornness that had survived the long journey from the Depression era to now. The fluorescent lights hummed their particular frequency of misery, casting that flat, unflattering glow that made everyone look vaguely ill. The cafeteria kitchen was already warm from the industrial ovens, a sharp contrast to the November cold still clinging to Margaret's skin. She hung David's windbreaker on her assigned hook, number 17, because they'd hired her in the 17th month after David died, a coincidence that felt like a sign of absolutely nothing, and pulled on the burgundy vest that marked her as staff. "Right on time, like always," Elena Pack said, from the coffee station, not looking up from the ancient machine she was coaxing back to life. Elena was 63, 7 years younger than Margaret's 58, but somehow seemed older in her efficiency, her no-nonsense approach to everything from coffee-making to life itself. She wore her dark hair in a practical bun, and her hands, Margaret always noticed hands now, were steady and sure, unmarked by arthritis or age. "Traffic was light," Margaret replied, the same response she gave every morning, regardless of whether it was true. Elena handed her a cup of coffee in a styrofoam cup. Terrible for the environment, Margaret thought reflexively, but thinking about the environment felt like a luxury she could no longer afford. The coffee was terrible too, bitter and thin, but it was hot and free, and that's what mattered now. "Your phone's been buzzing," Elena said, nodding toward Margaret's locker. "Since I got here at 5. Margaret's stomach tightened. Phone calls before 6 a.m. were never good news. She retrieved her phone, a 3-year-old iPhone with a cracked screen she'd been meaning to replace, but never did, and saw the notifications. 7 missed calls, 3 voicemails, 12 text messages, all from Charlene. The most recent text, sent at 5:19 a.m., read, "Family meeting Sunday, 3 p.m., mandatory. Don't make this difficult, Maggie." Margaret stared at the screen until it went dark, her reflection appearing in the black glass. A woman who looked older than 58, hair more grey than brown now, lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before grief had taken up residence in her face. When had she started looking so tired? When had she started looking so defeated? "Bad news?" Eleanor asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Just family," Margaret said, sliding the phone back into her locker. She didn't lock it. There was nothing in there worth stealing. Her purse contained $17 in cash, a collection of expired coupons she kept meaning to throw away but couldn't quite bring herself to part with. David's wedding ring on a chain, and a library card, the sum total of her portable life. "Family," Elena repeated, in a tone that suggested she understood exactly what that word meant, all the weight it carried, all the obligations and disappointments and small cruelties it contained. She'd never asked about Margaret's family, and Margaret had never volunteered. That was the unspoken agreement between them. Work was work, life was elsewhere, and the two didn't need to contaminate each other. But this morning, standing in the fluorescent glare of the hospital basement, smelling the ghost of yesterday's meatloaf and tomorrow's institutional gravy, Margaret felt something shift, a small crack in the careful walls she'd built. "They want to have a meeting," she said quietly. "Charlene, my sister-in-law." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, measuring coffee grounds with the precision of someone who'd spent a lifetime measuring things that mattered. Finally, she said, "Family meetings are never about anything good." "No," Margaret agreed. "They're not." The first trays began arriving at 5:45, carried by the night shift nurses grabbing breakfast before heading home. Margaret took her position behind the counter, her arthritic hands reaching for the serving spoons with practiced efficiency despite the pain. Oatmeal, toast, scrambled eggs that came from a carton, coffee, orange juice. The rhythm of serving, the small kindnesses of asking, "How are you?" even though the answer was always fine or tired or nothing at all. This was her life now, had been for 18 months, would be for how long? Forever. Until her hands finally gave out completely, until she was too old even for this. The thought settled over her like the November cold, and unlike the cold, she knew it wouldn't burn off with the morning sun. Outside, through the high basement windows, she could see feet walking past on the sidewalk. Sneakers, dress shoes, boots. People going somewhere, being someone, mattering to someone. And down here, in the fluorescent hum, Margaret Sullivan served oatmeal and tried not to think about Sunday at 3 p.m., tried not to think about Charlene's text, tried not to think about what mandatory meant. But she thought about it anyway, because that's what invisible people did. They thought about everything, noticed everything, and said nothing at all. The clock on the wall read 5:52 a.m., 10 hours and 8 minutes until her shift ended, 61 hours and 8 minutes until Sunday at 3 p.m. She flexed her aching hands and reached for the next tray. The Sullivan family home on Birchwood Drive had been photographed exactly once for posterity. A Polaroid taken in 1985. The colours now faded to that particular vintage palette, where greens became yellows and blues turned grey. In the photo, Margaret stood on the front steps beside David, both of them younger than seemed possible now, holding a sold sign between them like a trophy. She'd been 28, he'd been 31. The house had cost $47,000, which had felt like an impossible fortune at the time. Now, on this particular Sunday morning, Margaret sat in Eleanor's apartment, that rent-controlled one-bedroom in Stamford that smelled like Korean tea and old radiators, and held that photograph in her hand. She'd retrieved it from the house the night before, along with one suitcase of clothes and the contents of her jewelry box, which consisted mostly of David's things: his wedding ring, his father's watch, his Army Reserve dog tags. "You should eat something," Elena said, setting down a plate of kimchi fried rice. It was 11 a.m., and Margaret hadn't eaten since her shift ended at 4 p.m. yesterday. The rice steamed in the morning light, fragrant with sesame oil and garlic, but Margaret's stomach felt like a clenched fist. "I'm not hungry." "You're never hungry anymore," Elena observed, sitting across from her at the small kitchen table. "That's grief, or depression, probably both." Margaret set down the photograph and picked up her phone instead. More messages from Charlene, the most recent from 20 minutes ago. "Where are you? We're all here waiting. This is incredibly disrespectful." "I should go," Margaret said, but she didn't move, couldn't move. Her body felt leaden, as if gravity had suddenly remembered her and was pressing down with interest compounded over 18 months of numbness. "Tell me about the house," Elena said. Not a question, but not quite a command either. An invitation. And so Margaret told her. The house on Birchwood Drive had been a foreclosure when they found it, abandoned by a couple who'd divorced and let everything fall apart in the aftermath. The kitchen wallpaper had been peeling, water-stained and grotesque. The basement had flooded. The backyard was a jungle of neglect. But David had stood in the empty living room and said, "We can fix this. Together." And they had. Margaret had done the wallpaper herself, spending 3 weekends on a ladder while David worked overtime at the construction company. She'd learned to use a level, to match patterns, to smooth out bubbles. The beveled glass window in the living room, the one that cast rainbows across the oak floor on sunny afternoons, had been her idea. She'd found it at an architectural salvage yard for $15, and David had installed it, cursing and laughing in equal measure as he worked to make the old window fit the new frame. The basement filing room had been David's idea, but Margaret's execution, cedar-lined, temperature-controlled, with custom shelving David built from scratch. "For the business," he'd said. "We'll need to keep everything organized." The business. Sullivan Property Holdings, though it hadn't been called that at first. In the beginning, it was just David doing freelance property management for landlords who didn't want to deal with tenant complaints. Then, it was David and his brother Tom buying their first rental property, a duplex in Bridgeport that needed work. Then it was David starting to acquire commercial properties, small ones at first, always at auctions or foreclosure sales where Margaret's eye for value and David's charm with bankers made magic happen. Margaret had never wanted to be in the spotlight. She liked the paperwork, the quiet precision of title searches and lease agreements and tax documents. She liked knowing that everything was in order, that every I was dotted and every T was crossed. David was the face, the handshakes, the networking, the confidence that made people trust him with their properties and their money. But Margaret was the foundation. She knew this, even if no one else seemed to. She'd kept every document, every contract, every deed, every piece of correspondence, organized by year and property, cross-referenced and indexed with a system that made sense to her and no one else. The filing room in the basement had 34 boxes, each one carefully labeled in her neat handwriting. 35 years of work, 35 years of building something. "I thought we were building it together," Margaret said now in Elena's kitchen, her voice barely above a whisper. "But maybe I was just supporting him. Maybe that's all I ever was." Elena set down her coffee. She drank it from a thermos that said, "Reconcile this," in faded letters, and fixed Margaret with a look that was not unkind, but not gentle either. "Let me tell you something about supporting," she said. "I supported my firm for 12 years. I was the best forensic accountant they had. I found discrepancies that would have cost them millions. And you know what they told me when I found out the partners were cooking the books? They told me I was being hysterical, and they told me I misunderstood the numbers. They told me maybe I should take some time off to rest." Margaret had never heard this story. Eleanor had never offered it. "I left," Eleanor continued. Took my evidence to the SEC, testified, watched them all get indicted, and then I couldn't get hired anywhere because I was difficult and disloyal and couldn't be trusted to be a team player. You know what supporting gets you, Maggie? It gets you erased. So why are you here? Margaret asked. In this cafeteria, working for minimum wage when you could be... Because I chose peace over proving anything to anyone, Elena interrupted. I chose to stop performing. But that doesn't mean I forgot how to read a balance sheet. And that doesn't mean I can't recognize when someone's being played. Margaret's phone buzzed again. Charlene, this is your last chance. If you don't show up, we're proceeding without you. What do they want from you? Elena asked. Margaret laughed, a bitter sound that surprised them both. My pension, David's pension actually, his Army Reserve pension, $4,200 a month. They say the family needs it, that we all need to contribute proportionally because Richard's investments haven't been performing well. Elena's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes. David's Army pension. Yes, his government pension. From military service. 20 years in the reserve. He did it for the health care mostly, and because he believed in service. Margaret's voice caught. He was so proud of that uniform. Maggie, Elena said carefully, you know government pensions aren't transferable, right? You can't just give them away, even if you wanted to. They're protected assets. If David's name is on it, it goes to his beneficiary, you and no one else. It's literally illegal for you to sign it over to anyone. The words hung in the air between them. Margaret stared at Elena, processing. But Charlene said, Richard showed me a spreadsheet. He said if we all contributed, they're asking you for something you legally cannot give them, Elena said. Which means either they don't know that or they don't care. Either way, she trailed off, but the implication was clear. Margaret's phone buzzed again. This time, a call. Charlene's photo appeared on the screen. A professional headshot, expensive makeup, one of those Hermes scarves tied just so. Margaret answered, Hello? Where are you? Charlene's voice was shrill even through the phone. We've been waiting for over an hour. Richard had to rearrange his entire schedule for this. I'm not coming, Margaret heard herself say. The words felt foreign in her mouth. Silence. Then, Excuse me? I said I'm not coming, and I can't give you the pension. It's not transferable. I couldn't even if I wanted to. More silence. Margaret could hear voices in the background. Richard, probably Brandon. Then Charlene's voice, lower now, more dangerous. Is this because you're still upset about Thanksgiving? Maggie, we've talked about this. You need to move past your grief and think about the family. The family, Margaret repeated. Yes, the family, the people who are trying to stay afloat. Do you know how much our property taxes are? Do you know what Richard's office costs? We're all struggling, but some of us are mature enough to acknowledge that we need to help each other. Margaret thought about the filing room, the 34 boxes, the properties she'd found, the deals she'd structured, the foundation she'd built. And what have I been doing for 35 years, Charlene? Oh, for God's sake. Charlene's patience was clearly at an end. You know what? Fine. Don't come. But you need to understand something. That house you're living in, that's Sullivan family property. David would have wanted it to stay in the family, and if you're not going to be a team player, then maybe you need to think about whether you deserve to keep living there on our charity. The words hit like a physical blow. Our charity. You think I'm living on charity? Margaret's voice was steady, which surprised her. What else would you call it? You work in a hospital cafeteria, Maggie. You're barely making ends meet. We've been patient. We've given you time to grieve, but now it's time to face reality. Either you contribute or... Charlene let the threat hang unfinished. Elena was watching Margaret's face, her expression unreadable. Or what? Margaret asked. Or you need to make other living arrangements. I'm sorry, but that's just how it is. We can't keep carrying you. Something inside Margaret, something that had been bending for 18 months, finally broke. Not shattered, just broke clean. Fine. she said quietly. Fine what? Fine. I'll make other arrangements. Charlene's tone shifted, became almost sweet. Now, Maggie, you don't need to be dramatic. We can work this out if you just... I'll be out by tonight, Margaret said, and hung up. She set the phone on the table and looked at Elena. I just gave up my house. No, Elena said firmly. You just stopped negotiating with terrorists. There's a difference. Margaret laughed, and then, to her horror, she was crying. Not the gentle, dignified tears she'd cried at David's funeral, but ugly, heaving sobs that felt like they were tearing something loose inside her chest. Elena moved around the table and put her arms around Margaret, holding her while she broke apart in a way she hadn't allowed herself to break since the day they'd lowered David into the ground. I have nothing, Margaret gasped between sobs. I have nothing and no one, and I'm 58 years old, and my hands don't work anymore, and I can't even keep my own house. Shh, Elena said. That's not true, but we need to find out what you do have. Where are the documents, Maggie? Where are David's papers? In the basement, in the filing room. Can you get to them? Margaret pulled back, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. I still have my keys. They haven't changed the locks. Yet, Elena said. They will. Tonight, probably, after they realize you meant it. So we go now. We go right now before they get home, and we get those documents. Why? Margaret asked. What good will they do? Eleanor's smile was small but fierce. Because, Maggie, the person who keeps the records holds the power. They just don't always know it yet. I want to pause here and ask you something, friend. What caught your attention most in these early moments of Margaret's story? Was it Charlene's cruelty, wrapped up in therapy speak and fake concern? Was it the revelation that Margaret's own family is demanding something she legally cannot give? Or was it the quiet tragedy of a woman who built an empire with her own hands, but never wrote her name on the deed? Drop a comment below. Tell me what moment made your blood boil. Because Margaret's story is just beginning, and the fortress she doesn't know she built is about to reveal itself in ways that will leave Charlene and Richard wishing they'd never learned her name. Margaret and Elena drove to Birchwood Drive in Elena's ancient Honda Civic, a 1998 model that ran on sheer willpower and regular maintenance. It was 2:17 a.m. by the time they pulled up to the darkened house. No cars in the driveway, no lights on. The neighborhood was silent, except for the November wind rattling through bare branches. Margaret's hands shook as she fitted her key into the lock. For a moment she thought Charlene might have already changed it. But no, the lock turned, the door opened, and she was home. Except it didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like trespassing. Quickly, Elena whispered, though there was no one to hear them. Basement? The basement stairs creaked under their feet, each sound impossibly loud in the silent house. Margaret flicked on the light, and there it was, the filing room. Cedar-lined, temperature-controlled, 34 boxes, each one labeled in her handwriting. Elena's eyes went wide. Maggie, this isn't just family paperwork. These are corporate documents. David's business, Margaret said. I helped him organize everything, every property, every contract, every... Wait. Elena had opened the first box, was scanning documents with the speed of someone whose brain still knew how to read balance sheets. These aren't in David's name. This one's in Sullivan Property Holdings, LLC, and this one, and this one. Margaret frowned. That's the company David set up, for tax purposes. And who owns the company? David did. We did. I don't know. He handled all that. Elena pulled out another document, and another. Her hands were moving faster now, pulling files, scanning pages, her expression growing more intense. Maggie, do you have a safe deposit box? Yes, at First National. Why? Do you have the key? In David's toolbox. In the garage? Elena, what? Get it, now! Margaret didn't argue. She went to the garage, found David's old red toolbox, and there, taped to the inside of the lid, a small brass key. She'd never noticed it before. How many times had she opened this toolbox? Hundreds, thousands, and she'd never seen it. Or maybe she had seen it, but never thought it was for her to find. They left the house at 2:43 a.m., Elena carrying 2 of the file boxes, Margaret carrying David's toolbox and 1 suitcase of clothes. As they pulled away, Margaret looked back at the house, her house, the one she'd wallpapered and painted and loved for 35 years. "I'll never go back there," she said quietly. Elena glanced at her. "Maybe you won't need to." "What do you mean?" "I mean," Elena said, "I think your husband left you more than a pension, Maggie. I think he left you a fortress. We just need to find the blueprints." The streetlights cast long shadows across the empty road. Margaret clutched David's toolbox in her lap, feeling the weight of it, the reality of it. Inside, wrapped in an old chamois cloth, was his father's watch. A 1952 Omega that David had inherited and never worn, too precious for everyday use. Margaret had always thought it was silly, keeping something so valuable locked away. But maybe David had learned that from her. Maybe they'd both spent their lives keeping the valuable things hidden, protecting them from a world that might not recognize their worth. Or maybe, she thought as Elena drove through the sleeping streets of Riverside, they'd been hiding themselves. The clock on Elena's dashboard read 2:57 a.m. In 12 hours, First National Bank would open, and Margaret Sullivan, widow, cafeteria worker, invisible woman, would walk through those doors and discover exactly what her husband had left behind. Not just a pension, not just a memory, but the keys to a kingdom no one knew she'd built. The First National Bank of Riverside opened its doors at precisely 9 a.m., the way it had every weekday morning since 1923. The building was a relic of pre-Depression optimism. Marble floors, brass fixtures, vaulted ceilings that echoed with the footsteps of people who had places to be and money to move. Margaret had been inside exactly 4 times in the past 18 months, always to deposit her cafeteria paychecks, always using the ATM in the lobby, because the tellers behind their glass windows felt like they existed in a different dimension, one she no longer had access to. But today, at 9:17 a.m., she stood at the customer service desk with Elena beside her, David's toolbox on the counter between them, and the small brass key clutched in her arthritic hand. "Safe deposit box," Margaret said to the young woman behind the desk. Amanda, according to her name tag, fresh-faced and efficient in that way that suggested she hadn't yet learned that efficiency meant nothing when the world decided to break you. "Number 237. Amanda typed something into her computer, frowned, typed again. "And your name?" "Margaret Sullivan." More typing. The frown deepened. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Sullivan, but I'm showing that box is registered to David Sullivan. Is he with you today?" The question landed like a stone in still water. Margaret felt Elena stiffen beside her. "David Sullivan was my husband," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the way her hands were shaking. "He passed away 18 months ago. I'm his widow and the executor of his estate." Amanda's expression shifted from efficient to uncomfortable. Oh, I'm so sorry. Let me get my manager. Just one moment." She disappeared through a door marked private, leaving Margaret and Elena standing in the marble lobby where the air conditioning hummed with Arctic determination, and a security guard watched them with the bored vigilance of someone who'd seen it all and expected nothing. "They're going to ask for documentation," Elena murmured. "Death certificate, executor papers, probably 3 forms of ID. "I have the death certificate," Margaret said. "In my purse. I've been carrying it since—" She didn't finish. "Since when? Since the funeral. Since the day she realized that being a widow meant constantly having to prove your husband had existed, had died, had left you behind." The manager emerged. A woman in her 50s with steel-grey hair and a pantsuit that screamed, "I've been dealing with banking regulations since before you were born." Her name tag read, Patricia Holcomb, Assistant Manager. "Mrs. Sullivan," Patricia said, extending her hand. Margaret shook it, noting the firm grip, the way Patricia's eyes assessed her with the kind of attention that missed nothing. "I understand you're here to access box 237. May I see some identification?" Margaret produced her driver's license. David's death certificate, creased from being folded and unfolded too many times, and the letter from the lawyer declaring her executor of David's estate. Patricia examined each document with the thoroughness of someone who'd been burned before, who understood that paper could lie, but official seals usually didn't. "Everything appears to be in order," Patricia said finally. "If you'll follow me." They descended into the basement, because of course safe deposit boxes were always in basements, always in windowless rooms that felt like tombs for other people's secrets. The vault door was massive, circular, the kind of thing you saw in heist movies. Patricia used her key, then gestured for Margaret to use hers. The brass key slid into the lock with a soft click that felt too quiet for the moment, too anticlimactic for what was about to change. Box 237 was larger than Margaret had expected, not one of the small ones for jewelry and important papers, but a substantial rectangle that required both hands to slide out from its niche in the wall. Patricia left them alone in a small viewing room, another windowless space, this one with a single table and 2 chairs and lighting that made everything feel slightly unreal. "Open it," Elena said softly. Margaret lifted the lid. Inside, 3 manila envelopes, each one labeled in David's handwriting. The first, trust documents. The second, for Maggie, watch first. The third, property records. Elena reached for the trust documents, but Margaret stopped her. He said to watch first. The second envelope contained a USB drive, one of those cheap promotional ones from a trade show, the kind emblazoned with a logo for a company that probably didn't exist anymore. But David had covered the logo with a label, written in his careful block letters, "Christmas 2019 photos. There's a library 2 blocks from here," Eleanor said. "They have computers, public access. If you're enjoying Margaret's journey from invisible to inevitable, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button." Because what happens next? Well, let's just say that USB drive contains more than photos. It contains the truth. And the truth, as it turns out, has been waiting 18 months to be discovered. Don't miss what comes next. The Riverside Public Library smelled like old books and industrial carpet cleaner, a combination Margaret had always found comforting. They signed up for a computer, number 7, in the back corner where the teenagers usually camped out doing homework. And Elena inserted the USB drive while Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs with a violence that made her wonder if this was what David had felt in those last moments before his heart gave out. The drive contained 2 folders, one labeled Legal, one labeled For My Maggie. Margaret clicked on the second folder. Inside, a single video file. 23 minutes and 47 seconds long. She double-clicked. David's face filled the screen. He looked healthy, vibrant. This had been recorded before the heart attack, before the sudden collapse that had stolen him from a Tuesday morning while he was reading the newspaper and drinking his coffee at exactly 6:47 a.m., the way he always did. His hair was grayer than she remembered, or maybe she'd just forgotten, the way grief made you forget the small details while burning the big moments into permanent memory. "Hi, baby," David's recorded voice said, and Margaret made a sound that wasn't quite a sob. "If you're watching this, then I'm gone, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I didn't get to explain this to you in person. I had it all planned. Our 40th anniversary, I was going to take you to that Italian place you love, the one with the breadsticks you always steal extras of, and I was going to tell you everything. But life, as we both know, doesn't care much about plans." He smiled, that crooked smile that had first caught her attention 40 years ago in a college library, both of them reaching for the same book on property law. "Maggie, you're going to argue with this recording. You're going to say I did all the work, that you were just helping, that I built the business and you just, what's the phrase you always used, kept things organized. But let me tell you what I see, what I've always seen. Every property we bought, you found. Every contract we signed, you read. All of it, every clause, every loophole, every potential problem. You caught the issues before they became disasters. Every decision we made, you calculated. I was the face, because that's what the world wanted to see, a man in a suit, shaking hands, making deals. But you were the mind, the hands, the heart. Elena's hand found Margaret's shoulder, squeezed gently. I know what you're thinking, David continued. You're thinking about Charlene, about Richard, about the family, and you're probably wondering why I never put your name on things, why I kept calling it my business when we both knew it was ours. Here's the truth, Maggie. I knew. Even back in 2003, when Richard was sniffing around, trying to get involved, trying to get his hands on what we'd built, I knew what he was. I knew what Charlene would become. Mom used to say, David, you need to trust family. But I learned something working in construction, baby. You don't build on a weak foundation. You don't trust load-bearing walls to people who've never carried anything heavier than their own ego. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face, but she didn't wipe them away. So I did something. I restructured everything, took every property, every asset, every piece of our empire, and I put it into a trust, Sullivan Property Holdings, LLC. And I made you, not me, Maggie, you. I made you the primary trustee, the majority beneficial owner. Everything we built, it's in your name. It always should have been. He leaned closer to the camera, his expression serious now. By the time you're watching this, you'll know what Charlene's really like. I suspect she's shown you. I suspect she's made demands. I suspect she's made you feel small, made you feel like you owe the family something, made you feel like you're nothing without me. And I'm sorry I'm not there to tell her to go to hell myself. But here's what I need you to understand. The trust has protections built in. If any beneficiary, and yes, I made Richard, Charlene, and Brandon beneficiaries, because Mom would have haunted me if I didn't. If any of them try to coerce you, defraud you, or financially abuse you, they lose everything. Their beneficial interest transfers immediately to charity. It's ironclad. I had 3 lawyers check it. He smiled again, but this time it wasn't warm. It was the smile of a man who'd planned for war and knew he'd already won. The trust generates about $86,000 a month, Maggie. Has been for years. The distributions to you have been going into a separate account at First National. It matured 18 months after my death, which is now, if my timing's right. Check account number 44782293. Password is breadsticks because you're predictable and I love you. Margaret grabbed Elena's notepad and wrote down the account number with shaking hands. You're not poor, baby. You're not living on charity. You're a millionaire. You have been for 20 years. We just lived simply because that's who we are, who you are. You don't need the big house or the fancy car or any of that performance Charlene's addicted to. But you do need to know your worth. You do need to know that every brick in this empire has your fingerprints on it. His expression softened. I know you're working at that cafeteria. Tom Gerstein told me you took a job there, and I wanted to call you, wanted to tell you to stop, but I knew you needed to do something, needed to feel useful. That's who you are. You need to build, need to contribute. But Maggie, honey, stop working at that damn cafeteria. You're a millionaire. Act like it. Margaret laughed through her tears, a wet, broken sound. There's more in the legal folder. Trust documents, property records, everything you need to know about what we built, what you built. And Maggie, if Charlene comes for you, when she comes for you, don't fight her, don't argue, just leave, walk away, let the trust do its work. I built it to protect you, from her, from Richard, from anyone who thinks they can take what's yours. He paused, glanced off camera at something, then looked back. I love you. I loved you from the first moment I saw you in that library, pretending you understood property law when I could see you were reading the book upside down. I loved you through every late night, every early morning, every moment of building this life together, and I need you to understand, this isn't me taking care of you from beyond the grave. This is me finally putting your name on what was always yours. He leaned back, smiled that crooked smile one more time. Now stop crying, go to that bank, check that account balance, and book yourself a ticket to Italy like we always planned. Get the good wine. Steal the breadsticks. Live the life we built. You earned it. Every single brick. The video ended. Margaret sat in the library computer chair, staring at the black screen, listening to the sound of teenagers arguing about homework and the librarian shushing someone and the ordinary sounds of the world continuing to turn, even though hers had just shifted on its axis. "Maggie," Eleanor said quietly, "we need to check that account." Margaret nodded, but couldn't speak, couldn't move, could only sit there and process the fact that David had known, had planned, had spent his last years building her a fortress and disguising it as a marriage, not because she was weak, but because the world had always been too eager to take from women who built in silence. Elena pulled up the First National Bank website, navigated to the login page. "Account number 44782293, password breadsticks," she typed. Hit enter. The screen loaded. And there, in simple black text on a white background, was a number that made Margaret's breath catch. Current balance, $1,347,293.47. Below it, a transaction history. Monthly deposits, like clockwork. 50,000 here, 70,000 there. Varying amounts, but always substantial, always growing. For 18 months, while Margaret had been serving oatmeal in a hospital basement, this account had been filling like a reservoir, waiting for the dam to break. "Oh my God," Elena breathed. Maggie, do you understand what this means?" Margaret understood. She understood that she'd spent 18 months believing she had nothing. Understood that she'd let Charlene convince her she was living on charity. Understood that she'd been standing on a foundation of diamonds while being told she was lucky to have dirt beneath her feet. "We need to see the trust documents," Margaret said, her voice strange in her own ears. Steady, clear, not the voice of a woman who'd been broken. The voice of a woman who'd just realized she'd never been broken at all. Just bent, just hidden, just waiting. Elena opened the legal folder on the USB drive. Inside, scanned PDFs of every trust document, every property deed, every contract that made up Sullivan Property Holdings, LLC. And there, on page 3 of the trust agreement, in language that was dense but unmistakable, primary trustee and majority beneficial owner, Margaret Ann Sullivan. Below that, a list of properties. Margaret recognized them all. Of course she did. She'd found most of them, had done the title searches, had reviewed the purchase agreements. But seeing them listed here, under her name, was different, was revelation. The strip mall on Commerce Drive where Richard rented his office, $8,500 a month. The building on Main Street that housed Charlene's boutique, $12,000 a month. The land under the Vance estate in Greenwich, $2,400 a month. 4 residential properties that Brandon managed, $18,000 a month combined. The parking garage next to the courthouse, $45,000 a month. Monthly total, $86,300. "They've been paying you," Elena said slowly. "This whole time, they've been paying rent to properties you own, and they didn't even know it." Margaret scrolled down to the clause David had mentioned. Section 7, subsection C, removal of beneficial interest for financial abuse. "If any beneficiary shall attempt to coerce, defraud, financially abuse, or otherwise illegally obtain assets from the primary trustee, said beneficiary's interest in the trust shall immediately and irrevocably transfer to the designated charitable organizations listed in Appendix D. They demanded your pension," Elena said, her voice taking on that edge it got when she smelled corruption, when the numbers started telling stories. "They told you to give them money or get out of your house. That's textual evidence of financial elder abuse. And if they put it in writing..." Margaret's phone was in her purse. She pulled it out, opened her messages. There they were, Charlene's texts. All of them, demanding, threatening, "You need to contribute proportionally. That house is Sullivan family property. Either you help or you make other living arrangements. We can't keep carrying you." "Evidence," Elena said softly. "Documented, time-stamped evidence of financial coercion against an elderly widow. Maggie, Do you understand? They just triggered the removal clause. Everything they thought they had, their beneficial interest in the trust, their share of the properties, it's gone. The moment you left that house under duress, the moment you walked away because they threatened you, they invalidated their own inheritance. Margaret stared at her phone, at Charlene's words, at the casual cruelty disguised as family concern. "We can't keep carrying you." "I was never being carried," Margaret said quietly. "I was carrying them, the whole time, and they didn't even know." Her phone buzzed. Another text from Charlene. "Richard changed the locks on the house. We've been very patient with you, Maggie, but this is for the best. You can pick up your things next week." Eleanor watched Margaret's face. "What are you going to do?" Margaret looked at the computer screen, at the account balance that represented 18 months of accumulated trust distributions, at the property list that showed an empire she'd built brick by brick, at David's face frozen in the video player, smiling at her from beyond death. "I'm going to do exactly what David told me to do," Margaret said. "Nothing, nothing, nothing," Margaret confirmed. "I'm not going to fight them. I'm not going to argue. I'm not going to explain. I'm just going to stop being invisible." She pulled out the trust documents that Elena had printed from the library computer, found the contact information for the trust's law firm, Berkshire and Stone, a name she recognized because she'd organized their retainer agreement 15 years ago. She dialed the number. "Berkshire and Stone, how may I direct your call?" "James Berkshire, please. Tell him Margaret Sullivan is calling about Sullivan Property Holdings." A pause. Then, "One moment, Mrs. Sullivan." Less than 30 seconds. Then a man's voice, older, authoritative. "Mrs. Sullivan, we've been expecting your call." "You have?" "The trust has automatic notifications. When you left the family residence 3 days ago, our system flagged it as a potential trigger event. And when we reviewed the text messages that were sent to your phone, yes, the trust has access to phone records for all beneficiaries. It's in the fine print. We began proceedings to investigate potential financial abuse." Margaret closed her eyes. David had thought of everything. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," James Berkshire said, "we wait 72 hours. If the evidence supports a finding of financial coercion, which Mrs. Sullivan it very clearly does, then the beneficial interests of Charlene Sullivan Vance, Richard Vance, and Brandon Sullivan will be transferred to charity. Their monthly distributions will cease. Their access to any trust-owned properties will be subject to standard rental agreements with no family preference, and you, as primary trustee, will have full discretion over all trust assets. They'll have nothing. They'll have exactly what they contributed," James corrected gently, "which, according to our records, is nothing. Your name is on every property acquisition, Mrs. Sullivan, every document." David made sure of that. He made sure everyone would know this was your work, not his gift to you. Through the library window, Margaret could see Riverside going about its Monday morning, people walking to work, cars idling at red lights, the ordinary machinery of life that ground on, regardless of who was being crushed beneath its wheels. "How long until the 72 hours are up?" Margaret asked. 27 minutes, James Berkshire said. "I'd suggest you silence your phone, Mrs. Sullivan." "It's about to start ringing." Margaret looked at Eleanor, who'd been listening to every word. "He says 27 minutes. Eleanor checked her watch. "Then we wait. And Maggie, when your sister-in-law calls, when she begs and bargains and threatens, what are you going to tell her?" Margaret thought about David's voice on the video, about 35 years of being the foundation while being told she was just the support. About 18 months of grief and cafeteria shifts and believing she had nothing, about the empire she'd built in silence while the world looked past her. "I'm going to tell her," Margaret said slowly, "that I'm not destroying anything. I'm just no longer building for her. There's a difference." Elena smiled. "That's perfect. David would have liked it," Margaret said. "David," Elena replied, "would have been proud." They sat together in the library, watching the clock count down the 27 minutes that stood between Margaret Sullivan, widow and cafeteria worker, and Margaret Sullivan, millionaire and primary trustee of the empire she'd spent 35 years building. Somewhere in Greenwich, in a 7,000-square-foot modern farmhouse with Tesla solar panels and a $47,000 stove that had never been turned on, Charlene Sullivan Vance was about to discover that performance and substance were not the same thing, and that you couldn't take what was never yours to begin with. The clock ticked down. Margaret Sullivan, invisible no longer, waited for the fortress to reveal itself. The 72 hours ended at precisely 11:43 a.m. on a Wednesday morning. Margaret knew the exact moment because she was standing in Elena's kitchen, watching the second hand on the wall clock sweep past the 12, when her phone began to vibrate with such violence that it danced across the Formica counter like something possessed. Richard, calling. Margaret let it ring through to voicemail. The phone was silent for exactly 8 seconds before it started again. Richard, again. "You don't have to answer," Eleanor said, pouring tea into 2 mismatched mugs. The apartment smelled like omija, that sweet, sour Korean tea that Elena swore by for stress, and printer ink, because the bulletin board on the wall was now covered with printouts of trust documents, property records, and a timeline Eleanor had constructed with the precision of someone who'd spent decades following money trails. "I know," Margaret said, but she answered anyway. "Put it on speaker." "Maggie." Richard's voice was ragged, desperate. "Maggie, what the hell is happening? My rent check bounced. The property management company says the account is frozen. And Charlene just got an eviction notice for the boutique. What did you do?" Margaret looked at Elena, who nodded slightly. "Permission. Or maybe just solidarity." "I didn't do anything, Richard," Margaret said calmly. "I left the house, like Charlene asked me to. That's all. That's all. That's all." His voice cracked. "Our accountant just called. He says there's been some kind of legal action against the trust. He says we're being removed as beneficiaries. He says—" A pause, ragged breathing. "Maggie, he says you own everything, that you've always owned everything. That can't be right. That can't possibly be right." "It is right," Margaret said. "I'm the primary trustee of Sullivan Property Holdings. David set it up that way 20 years ago." Silence. "Then, you knew, this whole time you knew, and you let us—" "I didn't know," Margaret interrupted. "David never told me. He left the information in a safe deposit box. I found it 3 days ago." More silence. Margaret could hear another voice in the background, Charlene, shrill and insistent, demanding to know what was happening. "This is insane," Richard said finally. "You can't do this. We're family. We have rights. We'll sue. You'll what?" Margaret's voice remained steady, almost gentle. "You'll sue me for owning property that's been in my name for 2 decades. You'll sue me for leaving my own house after being threatened with eviction. You'll sue me for not giving you a pension that I legally cannot transfer, even if I wanted to." She heard him freeze, heard the moment the reality settled in. "The pension," he whispered. "Oh God, the pension was never—" "Government benefits aren't transferable, Richard. They're protected by federal law. You were asking me for something I couldn't give you even if I wanted to, which means you were threatening me for— What? To make me feel small? To make me believe I owed you something?" Charlene said— He stopped. "She said David told her. She said the family had always shared expenses, that it was tradition, that—" "Charlene lied," Margaret said simply, "or she misunderstood. Either way, you threatened to evict me from my own home because of a lie. And the trust agreement has a clause about financial abuse, a very specific clause. Maggie," his voice had shifted from anger to pleading. "Maggie, please, we didn't know. We thought we were just trying to stay afloat. Richard's investments haven't been performing, and we have expenses, and we thought—" "You thought I was poor," Margaret finished. "You thought I was helpless. You thought I needed you more than you needed me." "Yes. No. He was spiraling. The boutique. Charlene's boutique. The lease payment was due yesterday and the check bounced. If she doesn't pay by Friday, she loses the space. She's put everything into that store. Her whole identity. Please, Maggie. Please, you can't. I'm not doing anything, Margaret said. The trust is doing what David designed it to do, protecting me from people who would take advantage of his death to take advantage of me. But we're family. You told me I was living on charity, Richard. You changed the locks on my house. Charlene sent me text messages telling me to contribute or leave. That's not family. That's extortion. She heard Charlene in the background, closer now. Let me talk to her. Let me talk to her. There was a fumbling sound. Then Charlene's voice, thick with tears that might or might not have been genuine. Maggie, please. I'm sorry. I was stressed, and I said things I didn't mean. You know I love you. Your family. You're David's wife. I'm David's widow, Margaret corrected. And I'm the person who found every property you're currently being evicted from. I'm the person who structured every deal you thought Richard made. I'm the person who spent 35 years building a foundation you didn't know existed because you never bothered to look down. I don't understand, Charlene said, but her voice had changed. Less tears, more calculation. What do you want? Money? Is this about money? We can work something out. I don't want anything from you, Charlene. Then what? What do you want me to do? Margaret closed her eyes, thought about David's voice on the video, about 18 months of grief and cafeteria shifts and believing she was nothing, about the empire she'd built in silence. I want you to understand something, Margaret said quietly. When you told me to leave, when you said I was living on charity, when you made me believe I had nothing, you weren't taking anything from me. You were just showing me what I'd forgotten, that I built this, that every brick, every contract, every property has my name on it. David didn't give me this empire. We built it together, and he made sure I couldn't forget it even after he was gone. Maggie, I'm not destroying you out of spite, Margaret continued. I'm just done building for you. There's a difference. What does that mean? Charlene's voice had gone cold. Are you kicking us out? Are you taking everything? I'm not taking anything, Margaret said. You never had it to begin with. Your beneficial interest in the trust was conditional on not abusing the primary trustee. You violated that condition. The trust documents are very clear about what happens next. This is because of those text messages? Charlene's voice rose. I was upset. I was stressed. You can't destroy our entire lives over a few text messages. I can't destroy what you never built, Margaret said. The properties you thought you owned? I found them. The deals you thought Richard made? I structured them. The foundation you've been standing on for 20 years, I laid every stone. You just never noticed because you were too busy performing wealth to understand what wealth actually is. She could hear Charlene breathing, fast and shallow. You're really going to do this, Charlene said finally. You're really going to ruin us. I'm not ruining anything, Margaret replied. I'm just no longer subsidizing your illusion. What you do next is up to you. She hung up. The phone immediately began ringing again, but Margaret powered it off, set it face down on the counter, looked at Elena. How do you feel? Elena asked. Margaret thought about it, really thought about it. Tired, she said finally, but not the way I've been tired for the last 18 months. Not grief tired, not defeated tired, just tired of carrying people who never asked how much I could hold. That's fair, Elena said. The landline rang, Elena's ancient corded phone that she kept because cell towers go down. Elena answered, listened, then covered the mouthpiece. It's James Berkshire, from the Trust's law firm. He says it's important. Margaret took the phone. Mr. Berkshire. Mrs. Sullivan. I wanted to inform you that as of 11:43 this morning, the removal clause has been officially executed. Charlene Sullivan Vance, Richard Vance, and Brandon Sullivan have been formally removed as beneficiaries of Sullivan Property Holdings. Their distributions have ceased and their beneficial interests have been transferred to the designated charities as outlined in the trust documents. What about Brandon? Margaret asked. Brandon hadn't been part of the confrontation, hadn't sent threatening texts, had only been guilty of silence. Mr. Sullivan was included in the removal because he was present during the confrontation and failed to intervene in what was clearly financial abuse of an elderly family member. However, Berkshire paused, he's also been attempting to contact you. He left a message with our office, said he has information you need to hear, about his father, David's brother, and about what he found in his mother's files. What kind of information? He wouldn't say, only that it's relevant to the trust proceedings and that he wants to testify on your behalf if needed. Mrs. Sullivan, you're not required to speak with him, but he seems genuinely distressed. Margaret thought about Brandon, 9 years old and orphaned, taken in by her and David, the kitchen table covered in papers while she worked, and David made tea. Maggie's building us a castle, kiddo, brick by brick. Give me his number, she said. I'll call him. After she hung up, Elena raised an eyebrow. You're going to give him a chance? He was 19 when his father died, Margaret said. 29 now. Maybe he's finally old enough to understand what it means to stay silent when someone you love is being hurt. Or maybe he's just trying to get back into the trust. Maybe, Margaret agreed. But David believed in second chances. He gave Brandon everything: education, opportunities, a future. The least I can do is hear him out. She dialed the number Berkshire had given her. Brandon answered on the first ring. Aunt Maggie? His voice was raw. Aunt Maggie, I'm so sorry. I'm so fucking sorry. I should have said something. I should have stopped her. I was just sitting there like a coward texting, and I let them... He broke off. I'm sorry. Why are you calling, Brandon? Because I found something. In my mum's office. She keeps all the family papers, all Dad's old stuff. And there's... Aunt Maggie, there's a letter from my dad to Uncle David, written a month before Dad died. And it's... You need to see it. What does it say? It says... Brandon's voice cracked. It says he knew. He knew Mum was going to come for you after Uncle David died. He warned Uncle David. He told him to protect you from her. He said... A pause. He said, Charlene loves the performance of family more than the reality of it. When you're gone, she'll try to take everything from Maggie because she won't be able to help herself. Please, David, build her a fortress. Make it impossible for Charlene to hurt her. Margaret closed her eyes. David's brother, sweet, gentle Tom, who died of cancer at 37, had known, had warned David, and David had listened. I want to see the letter, Margaret said. I'll bring it to you. Where are you? She gave him Elena's address, hung up, looked at Elena. He's coming here, Elena said. It wasn't a question. He's coming here, Margaret confirmed, and if he's lying, if this is some scheme to get back into your good graces, then I'll know, Margaret said simply, and he'll leave. But Elena, David spent 2 years building me a fortress. The least I can do is give his nephew 30 minutes to prove he's not his mother. Elena nodded slowly. Your fortress, your rules. My fortress, Margaret agreed. My rules. Brandon arrived 47 minutes later, looking like he hadn't slept in days. His expensive suit, the one Margaret recognized from his law school graduation, was wrinkled. His usually perfect hair was a mess. His eyes were red. He stood in Elena's doorway, holding a manila folder like it was made of glass. I didn't know, he said immediately. I swear to God, Aunt Maggie, I didn't know any of it. I thought Uncle David left you the house and the pension, and that was it. I thought Mom was trying to help the family stay together. I thought... He stopped. I thought I was one of the good guys. Turns out I was just a coward who let the bad guys win. Come in, Margaret said. He sat at Elena's kitchen table, the same table where Margaret had sat 72 hours ago, believing she had nothing. The same table where she'd discovered she had everything. Brandon opened the folder. Inside, a letter, handwritten on yellow legal paper in the distinctive scrawl Margaret remembered from her brother-in-law. Read it out loud, Elena said, so we all hear it at the same time. Brandon nodded, began to read. David, I'm writing this because I'm too much of a coward to say it to your face. The doctors say I have maybe 6 months. Pancreatic cancer doesn't negotiate. So I'm using the time I have left to tell you things I should have said years ago. Charlene is going to come for Maggie when you're gone. I know, she's my sister, I should defend her, but I've watched her my whole life, David. I've watched her take and take and take, always justifying it as family helping family. I've watched her turn every relationship into a transaction, and I've watched her resent Maggie for 30 years because Maggie has something Charlene never will: substance. When you die, and you will, brother, we all do, Charlene is going to tell herself that Maggie was just riding your coattails. She's going to believe that you built everything and Maggie just happened to be there. She's going to convince herself that the family deserves what you built more than your widow does, and she's going to take it. She's going to pressure and guilt and manipulate until Maggie gives everything away, because that's what Maggie does. She gives, she builds, she supports. She carries. Please, David, build her a fortress. Make it impossible for Charlene to hurt her. Make sure everyone knows that Maggie built this empire with you, not for you. Make sure her name is on everything. Make it so clear, so legally airtight, that even Charlene's endless capacity for self-deception can't rewrite history. I'm sorry I won't be there to stop her myself. I'm sorry I'm leaving Brandon with her. God help that kid, having Charlene for a mother. If you can, if there's any way, look after him. Teach him what real work looks like. Show him that wealth isn't performance, but mostly protect Maggie. She's the best of all of us. She's the foundation we've all been standing on without even noticing. Don't let Charlene take that from her. Your brother Tom P.S. Tell Maggie I'm sorry I never said thank you. For everything. For raising Brandon when I got sick. For keeping the books. For being the person who made us all look better than we were. She deserves better than a deathbed apology from her brother-in-law, but it's all I've got left to give. The kitchen was silent, except for the radiator clanking its eternal rhythm. Brandon set down the letter with shaking hands. I found it 2 days ago, in a box of Dad's things Mom kept in storage. I don't think she ever read it. If she had, he trailed off. She wouldn't have done what she did. Even Mom isn't cruel enough to ignore a dying man's last request. Don't be so sure, Elena muttered. Maybe, Brandon said. Maybe not. Either way, I'm not her. I'm not going to be her. He looked at Margaret. I was copied on the trust documents when I passed the bar. I got the notification when you left the house. I knew what it meant, and I did nothing. I told myself it wasn't my business. That Mom knew what she was doing, that you'd be fine because you always were. He wiped his eyes roughly. I'm not asking for my beneficial interest back. I don't deserve it. I'm just asking you to know that I see it now. I see what you did, what you built, what you carried, while the rest of us just existed on top of it. Margaret looked at this boy, this man, who she'd helped raise, who she'd paid to educate, who'd sat silent while his mother tried to take everything. What do you want, Brandon? She asked quietly. I want to testify, he said. If this goes to court, if Mom tries to fight the trust removal, I want to testify about what I witnessed, about what Dad warned Uncle David about how right they both were. He paused. And I want to work for you, not for the money, not to get back into the trust, but because I need to learn how to be the person Dad thought I could be. The person you and Uncle David tried to raise me to be. Elena looked at Margaret. Margaret looked at the letter, at Tom's handwriting, at the warning written by a dying man who'd known his sister better than she knew herself. She loves the performance of family more than the reality of it. Tell me something, Margaret said to Brandon. When you got that notification about the trust, when you realized what was happening, what did you do? I documented everything, Brandon said. Every text message Mom sent you, every phone call Richard made, every witness who was in that room. I've been building a case against them for elder financial abuse for 3 days. I already contacted the state attorney's office. Margaret raised her eyebrows. You did what? I'm a lawyer, Aunt Maggie. Maybe not a good nephew, but a lawyer who knows elder abuse when he sees it, and what they did to you. He shook his head. It's not just unethical, it's criminal, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows it. Elena smiled slowly. I like him. The question is, Brandon continued, do you want to press charges? Because I have enough evidence to make this a criminal case, not just a civil trust matter. Margaret thought about Charlene, about the Hermes scarves and the Instagram posts and the performance of wealth that had always been more important than the reality of character. She thought about Richard drowning in his own gambling debts while demanding her pension. She thought about 18 months of grief and loneliness and believing she was nothing. And she thought about David's voice on the video. You're not leaving with nothing. They are leaving with exactly what they contributed. Nothing. No, she said finally. No criminal charges. They're losing everything that matters to them. Their illusion of wealth, their performance of success. That's punishment enough. Let them live with the consequences of who they chose to be. Are you sure? Brandon asked. I'm sure, but Brandon. She met his eyes. If you want to work for me, if you want to prove you're not your mother, then you don't work for free. You work as the trust's attorney. Full salary, standard contract, and the first thing you do is help me establish the David Sullivan Memorial Scholarship for non-traditional law students. People who need a second chance. People who built something in silence and need someone to notice. Brandon's eyes filled with tears. I can do that. Good. Start Monday. Elena will send you the details. After Brandon left, Elena poured more tea. Outside, the afternoon was fading into that particular November twilight that turned everything grey and gold. You gave him a second chance, Elena observed. David would have, Margaret said simply, and his father asked us to look after him. I'm just honouring that request. 15 years late, but still, you're more forgiving than I would be. I'm not forgiving, Margaret corrected. I'm just done carrying grudges along with everything else. Brandon can prove himself or he can't, but either way I'm not going to become like Charlene, so focused on what people took from me that I forget what I built myself. Elena raised her mug. To fortresses, and the women who build them. Margaret clinked her mug against Elena's. To fortresses, she agreed. Her phone, powered back on, buzzed with a new notification. An email from Berkshire & Stone. Subject line, Trust distribution complete. Action required. She opened it, read it twice to make sure she understood. The Trust's charitable distributions, the beneficial interests that had been removed from Charlene, Richard and Brandon, totaled $2.4 million. The designated charities, 3 organizations supporting women in business, elder care advocacy, and scholarships for first-generation college students. And at the bottom of the email, a note from James Berkshire. Mrs. Sullivan, your husband was very specific about which charities should receive these funds in the event of beneficiary removal. I think you'll find his choices telling. He clearly knew you would support them. Perhaps he knew you better than you knew yourself. J.B. Margaret smiled. David, always 3 steps ahead, always building, always loving her enough to show her what she couldn't see. The fortress hadn't just protected her from Charlene, it had protected her from her own invisibility. And now, standing in Eleanor's kitchen, with Korean tea and the smell of old radiators, and the knowledge that she'd spent 35 years building an empire she'd forgotten was hers. Now, Margaret Sullivan was finally ready to live in it. The story of Margaret Sullivan's fortress broke in the Fairfield County Business Journal exactly 1 week after the trust distributions were finalized. The article appeared on a Thursday morning, written by Yolanda Martinez, the investigative reporter who'd been tracking real estate irregularities in Connecticut for the past 3 years. The headline read, The Invisible Architect, How One Woman Built a Multi-million-dollar Empire While the World Credited Her Husband. Margaret was sitting in Elena's apartment when her phone started ringing. Not Charlene this time, not Richard, but numbers she didn't recognize, reporters, business journals, a producer from a local news station asking if she'd be interested in an interview. She let them all go to voicemail. You should read it, Elena said, setting her laptop on the kitchen table. The article was pulled up, complete with photos: the Sullivan home on Birchwood Drive, the strip mall on Commerce Drive, the parking garage downtown, and one photo that made Margaret's breath catch: her and David at a property auction in 2007, Margaret in the background holding a clipboard, David in the foreground shaking hands with the auctioneer. The caption read, "Margaret Sullivan left reviewing documentation at a 2007 property auction." While her husband David was often credited as the sole developer, court documents reveal Mrs. Sullivan was the primary researcher, analyst, and trustee of the family's real estate holdings. Margaret began to read. For 35 years, Margaret Sullivan worked in the shadows of Connecticut's commercial real estate market, while her husband, David Sullivan, became known as a savvy property developer with an eye for undervalued assets. Few people knew that his widow was the architect behind every acquisition. Court documents filed last week in Fairfield County Superior Court reveal a complex trust structure that placed Mrs. Sullivan, not her late husband, as the primary trustee and majority owner of Sullivan Property Holdings, LLC. The trust, established in 2003, controls an estimated $15 million in commercial and residential real estate throughout Connecticut. But the story of how Margaret Sullivan came to claim her empire is as much about family betrayal as it is about hidden wealth. According to legal filings reviewed by the journal, Mrs. Sullivan, 58, was the target of what attorneys are calling systematic financial elder abuse by family members who believed she was living on a modest pension after her husband's death in 2023. These family members, including David Sullivan's sister, Charlene Sullivan Vance, and her husband, Richard Vance, allegedly demanded Mrs. Sullivan surrender her deceased husband's military pension or vacate the family home. What they didn't know, Mrs. Sullivan owned the properties they were living in, working from, and profiting from. This is a case study in how women's labor, particularly administrative and analytical work, becomes invisible even when it's foundational to success, says Dr. Patricia Chen, a sociologist at Yale University who studies gender dynamics in family businesses. Margaret Sullivan spent decades doing the research, the documentation, the detail work that made her husband's public success possible. But because she wasn't the face of the business, because she worked behind the scenes, even her own family assumed she was financially dependent. The trust documents paint a picture of meticulous planning by David Sullivan, who restructured his business holdings in 2003 after his brother-in-law, Richard Vance, expressed interest in joining the family business. According to the documents, David Sullivan worried that Vance's reckless financial decision-making would endanger assets that he and his wife had spent decades building. The solution was elegant: a trust that named Margaret Sullivan as primary trustee and majority beneficial owner, with ironclad protections against financial abuse. If any beneficiary attempted to coerce or defraud Mrs. Sullivan, their beneficial interest would immediately transfer to charity. That's exactly what happened last month, after Mrs. Sullivan left the family home under duress. Documented through text messages and witness statements, the Trust's protective measures activated. Charlene Sullivan Vance, Richard Vance, and Brandon Sullivan, David Sullivan's nephew, were removed as beneficiaries. Their combined interests, worth approximately $2.4 million, were transferred to charities supporting women in business and elder advocacy. Meanwhile, Mrs. Sullivan discovered she had been a millionaire for 2 decades. She just didn't know it. "My husband left me a video message," Mrs. Sullivan told the Journal in her only statement. "In it, he said, 'You were always the architect. The documents are in your name, because they always should have been. I spent 18 months believing I had nothing. It turns out I had everything. I'd just forgotten I built it.' The fallout for the Sullivan-Vance family has been swift. Charlene Sullivan Vance's boutique in downtown Riverside closed last week after an eviction for non-payment of rent. Richard Vance's business office was similarly shuttered. Their 7,000-square-foot home in Greenwich, built on land owned by Sullivan Property Holdings, is now subject to accelerated lease payments after violations discovered during the trust review. Brandon Sullivan, who recently passed the Connecticut bar exam, was also removed as a beneficiary. However, sources close to the trust say he has been cooperating with investigators and has been hired as the trust's legal counsel, a position that comes with a salary but no ownership stake. This case raises important questions about family dynamics, gender and labor, and the ways we value different types of work, says James Berkshire, the attorney representing Sullivan Property Holdings. Margaret Sullivan's story isn't unusual. What's unusual is that her husband had the foresight to protect her from people who would exploit her grief and her humility. Mrs. Sullivan has established the David Sullivan Memorial Scholarship, which will provide full tuition support for non-traditional students pursuing legal education. The scholarship's first recipient will be announced next month. When asked what she plans to do next, Mrs. Sullivan's response was simple: live in the fortress I built and help other people build theirs. For 35 years, Margaret Sullivan was invisible. Now, the architecture of her life is finally visible for all to see. Margaret set down the laptop. Her hands were shaking, not from arthritis this time, but from something else. Something that felt like vindication and grief tangled together. She got it right, Elena said quietly. Every detail. How did she... Brandon, Margaret said. He must have talked to her, given her the documents, the timeline, everything. Are you angry? Margaret thought about it. Was she angry that her story was now public, that strangers would read about her humiliation, her family's betrayal, her 18 months of believing she was nothing? No, she said finally. No, I'm not angry, because every word is true, and maybe, she paused, maybe there are other women out there who need to hear this, who need to know that the work they do in silence matters. That being the foundation doesn't make you less important than being the face. Her phone rang again. This time she recognized the number. Mrs. Chen, her elderly neighbor from Birchwood Drive. Margaret answered. Mrs. Chen. Margaret! The old woman's voice was bright with excitement. I just read the article, the one in the paper about you. Is it true? Did you really own all those properties? It's true, Margaret said. I knew it, Mrs. Chen crowed. I told my daughter, I said, that girl worked 3 jobs while David built his business. She earned every brick, and now everyone knows. Oh, Margaret, I'm so proud of you. Something in Margaret's chest loosened. Thank you, Mrs. Chen. Are you coming back to the house? To Birchwood Drive? Margaret looked around Elena's apartment. The bulletin boards covered in documents. The smell of Korean tea. The radiator that clanked like a metronome, keeping time for a life in transition. I don't know yet, she admitted. It doesn't feel like home anymore. Well, Mrs. Chen said pragmatically, it's your house. You can make it feel like whatever you want, or you can sell it and buy something new. The point is, it's yours, always was. We all just forgot to notice. After they hung up, Eleanor made more tea. They sat together in the afternoon light, watching dust motes dance in the sun, listening to the sounds of the building settling around them. What are you going to do? Elena asked. Not pushing, just asking. I'm going to the house, Margaret said. To Birchwood Drive. I need to see it. Without them there. Without their voices in every room. Want company? Margaret smiled. Always. They drove to Birchwood Drive in Eleanor's ancient Civic, through the streets of Riverside that Margaret had known for 40 years, past the diner where David proposed, past the library where they'd met, past the elementary school where she'd volunteered before grief made her forget how to do anything but survive. The house looked smaller than she remembered, or maybe she'd just gotten bigger. Maybe 18 months of carrying grief had expanded her, made her too large for spaces that used to fit. The locks had been changed, but Margaret was the legal owner. She'd called a locksmith that morning. He'd met them there, verified her identity, and opened the door in under 5 minutes. The house smelled stale, unlived in. Charlene and Richard must have come to collect their things. The living room was noticeably emptier, the good furniture gone, but the bones of the house remained. The beveled glass window that cast rainbows. The oak floors Margaret had refinished herself. The kitchen that still smelled faintly of David's morning coffee ritual. Margaret stood in the living room where the confrontation had happened, where Charlene had screamed at her, where Brandon had sat silent, where Richard had shown her that spreadsheet demanding she contribute proportionally to a life that was already hers. "How do you feel?" Elena asked. Margaret closed her eyes, breathed in the ghost of lavender sachets and old coffee, opened them again. "Empty," she said. "This house is empty, and I think I'm okay with that." She walked to the basement, down the stairs that creaked in the same places they always had, to the filing room. The cedar-lined room that David had built, the temperature-controlled space that held 34 boxes of documents spanning 35 years of work. Most of the boxes were still there. Charlene and Richard had taken a few, probably thinking they contained something valuable, not realizing the most valuable thing in this room was the knowledge of what it all meant. And that knowledge lived in Margaret's memory, not in the papers themselves. She ran her arthritic fingers along the spines of the boxes, each one labeled in her handwriting, each one a year of her life, of their life. Sullivan Holdings, 1988, property, acquisitions, 1995, commercial leases, 2003, trust documents, 2003-2023, 35 years of invisible work, now visible to anyone who knew how to read it. "Are you going to keep them?" Elena asked. "Some," Margaret said, "the important ones. The rest," she paused, "the rest can go to the Scholarship Foundation. Let law students study them. Let them see what building something looks like from the inside. Let them understand that the person who keeps the records holds the power." She picked up one box at random, opened it. Inside, property surveys, title searches, lease agreements from 1992, her handwriting on every page, her analysis, her recommendations, her work, and on the very bottom, a note from David, written on the back of a survey map. "Maggie, you found this one. The seller didn't even know what he had. You saw the potential. You always do. I'm just the guy who signs the checks. You're the architect." Margaret folded the note carefully, put it in her pocket, closed the box. "I'm ready to go," she said. "Are you sure?" Elena asked gently. "This is your house. You don't have to leave if you don't want to." "I know," Margaret said, "but it's not about having to. It's about wanting to. And I don't want to live in a space that's haunted by people who tried to make me believe I was small. I want—" She trailed off, searching for the words. "I want to live somewhere that remembers I was always big. I just forgot to notice." They left the house together. Margaret locked the door behind her. Her door, her lock, her choice. On the front step, she paused, looked at the house one more time, the house she'd bought for $47,000 when she was 28. The house worth $890,000 now. The house that had sheltered her love and her grief and her invisible labor for 4 decades. "Goodbye," she said quietly. Not to the house, to the version of herself who'd lived there. The version who'd believed she needed permission to take up space. That Margaret was gone now. The one who remained was the architect. And architects don't ask permission to build. That evening, back at Elena's apartment, Margaret's phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer, still wary of reporters, of people wanting her story. But something made her pick up. "Mrs. Sullivan," a woman's voice, young, uncertain. "My name is Taylor Morrison. I'm a law student at UConn. I read the article about you today, and I'm sorry to bother you, but I had to call." "It's no bother," Margaret said carefully. "How did you get my number?" "Brandon Sullivan gave it to me. He said you were establishing a scholarship for non-traditional students. I wanted to ask—" Taylor's voice broke slightly. "I wanted to ask if it was real, if someone like me could actually apply. Someone like you. I'm 42. Taylor said. "I have 3 kids. I've been working as a paralegal for 15 years, doing other people's work, watching lawyers take credit for my research. And I thought it was too late for me, that I missed my chance. But then I read about you, about how you spent 35 years building something in silence, and I thought maybe it's not too late. Maybe there are scholarships for people like us, people who start late, people who've been invisible." Margaret closed her eyes, felt tears sliding down her cheeks. "It's real," she said. "The scholarship is real. And Taylor, you're not starting late. You're starting exactly when you're supposed to. Give Brandon your information. He'll make sure your application is reviewed." "Thank you," Taylor whispered. "Thank you for showing us that invisible work matters, that we matter." After they hung up, Margaret sat in the darkening apartment while Elena cooked dinner and the radiator clanked its familiar rhythm. She thought about David, about the video message he'd left, about the fortress he'd built to protect her from people who would diminish her. But mostly, she thought about Taylor Morrison, 42 years old, 3 kids, 15 years of invisible work, calling a stranger because a newspaper article gave her hope. That was the real fortress, Margaret realized. Not the money, not the properties, not even the trust documents or the legal protections. The fortress was the story, the evidence that invisible work had value. The proof that women who built in silence built something real, and now that fortress was big enough for others to shelter inside. David had protected her, but she would protect the ones who came after. That was the legacy. That was the architecture. That was love, continuing past death, past grief, past invisibility, into something larger than one woman's vindication. Elena set a plate in front of her. Kimchi fried rice, fragrant and steaming. "You're smiling," Elena observed. "I am," Margaret agreed. "Why?" Margaret thought about how to answer, about Taylor Morrison and the scholarship and the article that had made her story public, about 35 years of work finally being seen. "Because," she said finally, "I spent 18 months thinking David's last gift to me was protection. But I was wrong. His last gift was evidence. Evidence that I was always enough, that I always mattered, that the fortress was mine all along." She picked up her fork. "I'm just finally learning how to live in it." Eleanor raised her thermos. "To architects and to fortresses, and to women who build both." "To architects," Margaret echoed. Outside, night had fallen on Riverside. But inside Elena's apartment, that rent-controlled one-bedroom that smelled like Korean tea and printer ink, Margaret Sullivan sat in the light and ate her dinner and planned her future. A future where invisible women became visible, where silent builders found their voices, where the fortress protected not just one widow, but all the women who came after. David had built her a foundation. Now Margaret would build on it, and this time everyone would know her name. 3 weeks after the article published, Margaret stood in the lobby of the Fairfield County Courthouse, the same courthouse where she'd spent countless hours over the years, researching title histories and filing documents. The same courthouse whose parking garage generated $45,000 a month, her parking garage, though she'd only recently learned to think of it that way. Today, she wasn't here for property records. Today she was here because Charlene was suing. The lawsuit had been filed on a Friday afternoon, the legal equivalent of leaving a flaming bag on someone's doorstep. Sullivan Vance vs. Sullivan Property Holdings, LLC. Charlene was claiming undue influence, arguing that David had manipulated Margaret into accepting the trust structure, that Margaret was mentally unfit to serve as trustee, that the removal clause was punitive and should be invalidated. It was desperate. It was transparent. And according to James Berkshire, it was also completely without merit. "She's grasping at straws," Berkshire had told Margaret over the phone. "This case won't survive summary judgment. But she has the right to file and we have to respond." So here Margaret was, dressed in her one good suit, navy blue, bought for David's funeral and not worn since, walking through metal detectors alongside Elena and Brandon, who carried a leather briefcase stuffed with documentation. "You don't have to testify today," Brandon reminded her as they rode the elevator to the 5th floor. "This is just a preliminary hearing. Judge Holcomb will review the motion and decide if there's enough merit to proceed." "Judge Holcomb?" Margaret repeated. The name was familiar, though she couldn't place from where. "Patricia Holcomb," Brandon confirmed. "She's been on the bench for 20 years. Fair but tough, doesn't suffer fools." The courtroom was smaller than Margaret expected. Not the grand theatrical space from television dramas, but a functional room with fluorescent lighting and worn carpet. Charlene sat at the plaintiff's table with her attorney, a young man in an expensive suit who kept checking his phone. Richard wasn't with her. That was interesting. Charlene looked diminished somehow. Her hair was still perfect, her makeup still precise, but there was something brittle about her now, something that suggested the armor was cracking. Their eyes met across the courtroom. Charlene's gaze was pure venom. Margaret looked away first, not out of fear, but out of disinterest. Charlene's anger couldn't touch her anymore. "All rise," the bailiff called. "The Honorable Judge Patricia Holcomb presiding." Judge Holcomb entered in a swirl of black robes. She was in her late 60s, with steel grey hair and the kind of face that suggested she'd seen every trick in the book and wasn't impressed by any of them. She took her seat, adjusted her glasses, and surveyed the courtroom with the expression of someone who had better things to do, but would do this properly anyway. "Be seated," she said. Her voice was crisp, authoritative. "We're here for a preliminary hearing on Sullivan Vance versus Sullivan Property Holdings. Let's start with the plaintiff. Counselor, this is your motion. Make it quick and make it good." Charlene's attorney stood. "Your Honor, my client, Mrs. Charlene Sullivan Vance, is seeking to invalidate certain provisions of the Sullivan Property Holdings Trust on the grounds that—" "I've read your filing," Judge Holcomb interrupted. "You're arguing undue influence and mental incapacity. What's your evidence?" The attorney shuffled papers. "Your Honor, the trust was structured in such a way that my client and her family were unaware of its terms until they were suddenly and without warning removed as beneficiaries. It suggests they didn't read the trust documents," Judge Holcomb said dryly. "Not reading something doesn't make it invalid. What else?" "The removal clause is punitive, Your Honor. It was designed to protect the primary trustee from financial abuse," Judge Holcomb finished. "Yes, I read that part too. Are you arguing that such protection shouldn't be allowed?" The attorney hesitated. "We are arguing that the threshold for removal was too low, that a few text messages and a family disagreement shouldn't result in—" "A few text messages." Judge Holcomb picked up a document from her bench. "Let me read one for the record. Your pension or get out. That was sent by your client to Mrs. Margaret Sullivan, a 58-year-old widow, regarding a government pension that Mrs. Sullivan has no legal authority to transfer. Would you call that a family disagreement, Counselor, or financial coercion?" The attorney's face flushed. "Your Honor, my client was under financial stress. She didn't understand that you can't demand someone give you money they don't have the legal right to give. Didn't understand that threatening to evict someone from their own home is illegal." Judge Holcomb set down the document. "Your client is a 52-year-old woman with a college education and access to legal counsel. I'm not inclined to accept ignorance as a defense." Charlene's attorney sat down, looking defeated. "Defense?" Judge Holcomb turned to Berkshire. James Berkshire stood. He moved with the confidence of someone who knew he'd already won, but was too professional to show it. "Your Honor, this is a straightforward case. The trust was properly executed. Mrs. Margaret Sullivan is and has always been the primary trustee. The removal clause was triggered by documented evidence of financial elder abuse. My client has broken no laws and violated no fiduciary duties. The plaintiff is simply unhappy with the consequences of her own actions." "I've reviewed the evidence," Judge Holcomb said. "Text messages, witness statements, documented threats. It's compelling, but I want to hear from Mrs. Sullivan herself." She looked directly at Margaret. Mrs. Sullivan approached the bench. Margaret stood on shaking legs, walked to the witness stand. The bailiff swore her in. Her arthritic hands trembled as she placed them on the Bible. Judge Holcomb studied her for a long moment. "Mrs. Sullivan, do you recognize me?" Margaret looked closer. There was something familiar about the judge's face, about the set of her jaw, about the library, Margaret said suddenly. "The Riverside Library. You were the reference librarian. That was 30 years ago." Judge Holcomb smiled slightly. 32 years, to be precise. I went to law school late, night classes while I worked. You used to come in every Saturday morning with your husband. You'd pull property records while he read the newspaper. I remember thinking how unusual it was. Most wives sat and waited. You worked. "I didn't know you remembered," Margaret said. "I remember everyone who works hard in silence," Judge Holcomb said. "It's a particular kind of labor. The kind that holds everything together but rarely gets recognized." She glanced at Charlene. "Mrs. Sullivan, I want to ask you directly. Did you feel coerced into leaving your home?" "Yes," Margaret said quietly. "Did you feel financially threatened?" "Yes." "Did you believe you had any choice in the matter?" Margaret thought about that Sunday afternoon, about Charlene's tears and Richard's spreadsheet and Brandon's silence, about the text messages and the changed locks and the casual cruelty of being told she was living on charity. "No," she said, "I didn't believe I had a choice. I thought they were right, that I owed them something, that I was nothing without David, that the house was theirs to give or take away." "And now," Judge Holcomb asked, "what do you believe now?" Margaret looked at Charlene, at the expensive clothes and the perfect hair and the brittle rage that couldn't hide the fear underneath. "Now I believe I spent 35 years building something in silence, and just because I worked quietly doesn't mean I didn't work at all." Judge Holcomb nodded. "Thank you, Mrs. Sullivan. You may step down." Margaret returned to her seat. Eleanor squeezed her hand. Judge Holcomb shuffled papers on her bench, took her time, let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. Finally she spoke. "I'm going to be very clear," she said. "This case is without merit. The trust was properly executed. The removal clause was legally sound and appropriately triggered. Mrs. Sullivan has done nothing wrong except have the misfortune of being related to people who mistook her humility for weakness." Charlene's attorney started to stand. Judge Holcomb held up a hand. "I'm not finished. Mrs. Sullivan Vance, you are claiming your brother-in-law manipulated your sister-in-law into accepting a trust structure that gave her, not him, her, complete control of assets worth millions of dollars. Do you understand how that sounds? You're arguing that a man manipulated his wife into being powerful, that he forced her to own property, that he coerced her into financial security." Charlene's face was red now. "Your Honor, that's not—" "It's exactly what you're arguing," Judge Holcomb interrupted, "and it's insulting, not just to your sister-in-law, but to every woman who's ever had her work dismissed as someone else's gift. David Sullivan didn't give his wife an empire. The evidence is clear. She built it with him. Her name is on every property acquisition, every title search, every document. She was the architect. He was simply honest enough to put that in writing." Judge Holcomb closed the file folder in front of her with a decisive snap. "Motion denied. This case is dismissed with prejudice, which means, Mrs. Sullivan Vance, that you cannot refile it. The trust stands. The removal clause stands. And Mrs. Margaret Sullivan remains exactly what she's always been, the rightful owner of everything she built." The gavel came down. Bang! "We're adjourned." In the hallway outside the courtroom, Charlene tried to approach Margaret. Her attorney had disappeared, probably billing his hours and mentally writing off this loss, leaving Charlene alone in her expensive clothes and crumbling dignity. "Maggie," she said. Her voice was different now, smaller. "Maggie, please, can we talk?" Elena stepped between them. "I don't think that's a good idea." "I just want 5 minutes," Charlene said. "Please, I'm sorry." I was wrong. I see that now. I just want to—" "You want to what?" Margaret asked quietly. "Apologize, explain, make excuses." "All of it," Charlene admitted. "None of it I don't know. I don't know how this happened, how we got here." "I do," Margaret said. "You thought I was small. You thought I was nothing without David. You thought you could take what you wanted because I wouldn't fight back. And you were right, I didn't fight. But not because I was weak. Because I didn't need to. David built protections around me 20 years ago because he knew, even if I forgot, that I was worth protecting." Charlene's carefully applied makeup was starting to crack around her eyes. "I lost everything, Maggie. The boutique, the house. Richard left me. Did you know that? He emptied our joint account and moved to Florida 3 days ago. I have nothing. I am nothing." "You have exactly what you built," Margaret said. "Not cruelly, just factually. Which is nothing. You performed wealth instead of creating it. You borrowed against my assets and called it success. You lived on credit, financial and moral, and now the bill is due. So that's it?" Charlene's voice broke. "You're just going to let me fall? After everything? After 30 years of being family?" "We were never family," Margaret said quietly. "We were just people who shared a last name. Family doesn't threaten. Family doesn't coerce. Family doesn't tell a grieving widow she's worthless and should be grateful for charity." She paused. "I hope you find somewhere soft to land, Charlene, but it won't be with me. Not anymore." She walked past her sister-in-law, flanked by Eleanor and Brandon. Behind her, she heard Charlene make a sound, something between a sob and a gasp. Margaret didn't turn around. In the parking garage, her parking garage, generating $45,000 a month, Brandon paused by his car. "That was harder than I expected to watch," he admitted. "She's my mother, and she's—" He trailed off. "Broken," Margaret finished. "She's broken. But Brandon, she broke herself. I didn't do this to her. I just stopped catching her when she fell." "I know," Brandon said. "I know, it's just hard to watch." "It is," Margaret agreed. "But you know what's harder? Watching someone you love make you invisible. Watching them convince you that your work doesn't matter, that you don't matter. That's harder, trust me." Brandon nodded slowly. "I'm sorry I let that happen." "You were 19 when your father died," Margaret said. "You're 29 now. You have the rest of your life to be better than your mother. Don't waste it feeling guilty about the past. Use it to build a better future." "Like you did," Brandon said. "Like David and I did," Margaret corrected. "Together. That's the part everyone forgets. It wasn't just him protecting me, it was us protecting each other. Building something that would outlast us both." She looked up at the concrete levels of the parking garage, stretching above them, at the ordinary building that generated extraordinary income, at the invisible infrastructure that made everything else possible. "That's what love looks like," she said. "Not performance, not drama, not Instagram posts or expensive gifts. Just two people building something together and making sure the one who survives remembers they were always strong enough to stand alone." Elena's car was parked on level 3. They rode the elevator in comfortable silence. When they emerged into the afternoon sunlight, Margaret pulled out her phone. She had 17 missed calls. Most were from reporters. One was from Taylor Morrison, the law student, and one was from a number she didn't recognize with a Rome, Italy area code. She listened to the voicemail from Rome. "Mrs. Sullivan," a man's voice, accented formal. "This is Giovanni Rossini from the Hotel Hassler Roma. We received your reservation request for next month and wanted to confirm the details of your suite. We're delighted you'll be staying with us. Your late husband stayed here many times on business, and we remember him fondly. We look forward to welcoming you. Arrivederci." Margaret stared at the phone. David had stayed at the Hotel Hassler? When? Why had she never known? She called the hotel back. Giovanni Rossini answered on the second ring. "Ah, Mrs. Sullivan, how wonderful to hear from you. Mr. Rossini, I'm confused. My husband stayed at your hotel?" "Many times, every year for—" A pause while he checked records. "For 15 years, always in March, always the same suite, always for 1 week. He would tell us he was here on business, but he would spend his days walking around the city, taking photographs, collecting menus from restaurants. He said he was planning a trip with his wife for your 40th anniversary. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. He never told me. Ah, Signora, forgive me. Perhaps it was meant to be a surprise. He would ask us questions. What is the most romantic restaurant? Where is the best gelato? Can you arrange a private tour of the Sistine Chapel? He was planning something special for you. He died, Margaret whispered, before our 40th anniversary, before he could bring me. I am so sorry, Giovanni said softly. But Signora, you are coming now, yes? The reservation is made. The suite is ready. Perhaps you can see Rome the way he saw it. The way he wanted you to see it. Yes, Margaret said. Yes, I'm coming. Thank you for telling me this. After she hung up, she sat in Elena's car and cried. Not from grief this time, from something else. From the realization that David had spent 15 years preparing a surprise he'd never gotten to give. That even in death, even in silence, he was still showing her she mattered. Elena started the car, but didn't put it in gear. Just let Margaret cry until she was done. He really loved you, Elena said finally. He really did, Margaret agreed. And you know what the most amazing part is? I loved him just as much. For 40 years we loved each other, built together, protected each other, and I forgot. For 18 months I forgot what we had, what we were. I let grief convince me I was half a person without him. And now? Elena asked. Margaret wiped her eyes, looked at her arthritic hands, at the phone with its Rome confirmation and its scholarship applications, and its evidence that her life was bigger than her grief. Now, I remember, she said. I'm not half a person. I'm a whole person who had the gift of being partnered with another whole person. We built something together. And the fact that he's gone doesn't erase what I contributed, doesn't erase what I built, doesn't erase who I am. Elena put the car in gear. Where to? Margaret thought about Birchwood Drive, about the house with its changed locks and its empty rooms, about the filing room with its 34 boxes of documents. She thought about Elena's apartment with its bulletin boards and its radiator and its smell of Korean tea. She thought about Rome. About David walking the streets alone, planning a trip he'd never take, collecting menus and taking photographs, and preparing to show her a world beyond Riverside, Connecticut. The real estate office on Main Street, Margaret said. I want to sell the house. Are you sure? I'm sure. It's time to stop living in spaces that remember me as small. It's time to build something new. And then? Margaret smiled. And then I want to look at apartments. Real ones. Not just Elena's couch. Something with good light and enough space for an office. Somewhere I can work. Work on what? On the scholarship. On the trust. On helping other invisible women become visible. She paused. And on living, Elena. Just living. The way David and I always planned to. The way I forgot I was allowed to. They drove through Riverside in the afternoon light. Past the diner where David had proposed. Past the library where they'd met, past the ordinary streets of an ordinary town where Margaret Sullivan had spent 40 years building an extraordinary life. And this time, when she looked out the window, she didn't see the ghosts of what she'd lost. She saw the architecture of what she'd built, and what she was still building, brick by brick, in silence no longer, with her name on every foundation. The fortress wasn't just protecting her anymore, it was becoming her, and she was finally learning how to live in it. The first scholarship recipient was announced on a cold morning in January, exactly 3 months after Margaret had discovered the USB drive in the safe deposit box. The announcement was made in a conference room at the Riverside Public Library, the same library where Judge Holcomb had once worked as a reference librarian, where Margaret had spent countless Saturday mornings researching properties while David read the newspaper. Margaret stood at a small podium, looking out at the assembled crowd, reporters from local papers, representatives from the charities that had received Charlene's forfeited trust interests, law students from UConn and Yale, And most importantly, 12 applicants who'd submitted essays for the David Sullivan Memorial Scholarship. Taylor Morrison sat in the front row, her 3 children beside her. She wore a navy suit that looked recently purchased and held her 12-year-old daughter's hand with visible tension. Margaret cleared her throat. The room fell silent. 40 years ago, she began, I met a man in a library. We were both reaching for the same book on property law. I was pretending I understood it. He knew I was pretending and asked me to coffee anyway. Soft laughter rippled through the room. We spent 4 decades building something together. Properties, yes. A business, certainly. But more than that, we built a partnership. The kind where one person's work doesn't diminish the others. Where being the foundation is just as important as being the face. Where invisible labor is recognized as labor nonetheless. She paused, looking down at her notes, though she didn't need them. She'd memorized every word. My husband died believing I understood my worth, but grief has a way of making us forget who we are. I spent 18 months working in a hospital cafeteria, convinced I had nothing, and then I discovered he'd left me evidence. Not just of financial security, but of something more important, proof that my work mattered, that I mattered, that 35 years of research and analysis and documentation wasn't just supporting him. It was building an empire. Taylor Morrison was crying now, though trying to hide it. The David Sullivan Memorial Scholarship exists because my husband knew something I'd forgotten. Invisible work has value. Women who build in silence build something real. And the ones who start late, who come to their power after years of being told they're too old, too tired, too far behind, they're not late at all. They're exactly on time. She opened the envelope in front of her. This year's scholarship, providing full tuition for 3 years of law school, goes to Taylor Morrison, a 42-year-old mother of 3, a paralegal for 15 years, a woman who spent decades doing other people's work and watching them take credit. A woman who's not starting late. She's starting now. The room erupted in applause. Taylor stood on shaking legs, her children hugging her, tears streaming down her face. She made her way to the podium where Margaret waited. I can't believe this, Taylor whispered as Margaret handed her the certificate. I can't believe this is real. It's real, Margaret assured her. And Taylor, when you graduate, when you pass the bar, when you start practicing, remember this moment. Remember what it felt like to be invisible, and make sure you see the other invisible people. Make sure you recognize their work. Make sure they know they matter. Taylor nodded, unable to speak. As the crowd dispersed, Elena appeared at Margaret's elbow. That was perfect, she said. David would have been proud. David would have given the speech better, Margaret said. He was always better with words. No, Elena corrected. He was better at performing. You're better at truth. There's a difference. They walked out of the library together into the January cold. Margaret's new apartment was only 3 blocks away, a 2-bedroom on the 4th floor of a converted textile mill, with high ceilings and enormous windows and enough space for a proper office. She'd moved in 2 weeks ago, selling the Birchwood Drive house to a young couple expecting their first child. The wife had cried when Margaret showed her the beveled glass window that cast rainbows across the floor. It's perfect, the woman had said. It's exactly what we've been looking for. Margaret had smiled and thought, yes, it's perfect for you. It stopped being perfect for me. Now, as she and Elena climbed the stairs to the 4th floor, Margaret refused to take the elevator, needing the movement, the reminder that her arthritic hands might protest, but her body could still carry her. She felt something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not happiness exactly. Grief still lived in her chest, still woke her at 3 a.m. sometimes with the hollow ache of missing David. But peace. The kind that came from knowing she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Her apartment smelled like fresh paint and new furniture. She'd bought a desk, a real one, solid oak, with drawers that actually worked, and set it up beneath the largest window. From here, she could see the riverside town green, the church steeple, the ordinary machinery of life continuing its daily rhythm. On the desk, her laptop, now connected to the trust's legal databases. Files from Brandon, organized and color-coded. A framed photo of her and David at a property auction in 2007, the same photo that had run in the Fairfield County Business Journal, except this copy was printed larger, clearer. In it, Margaret held her clipboard. Mid-calculation, while David smiled at the auctioneer, both of them working, both of them building. Elena made tea. She'd brought her thermos, as always, while Margaret checked her email. 347 unread messages. Most were from reporters wanting follow-up interviews. Some were from women sharing their own stories of invisible labor. A few were from family members of the charities that had received Charlene's forfeited trust interests, thanking her for the unexpected windfall. And one, sent at 11:47 p.m. the previous night, from an address she didn't recognize. Ovance2024@gmail.com, Richard. Margaret's finger hovered over the delete button. She could just erase it, pretend she'd never seen it. Move on with the clean narrative where the villains disappeared into well-deserved obscurity. But curiosity won. She opened the email. Mrs. Sullivan, I don't expect you to read this. I wouldn't if I were you, but I need to write it anyway. I'm in Tampa, working at a car dealership, selling Hondas to retirees. It's honest work, which is more than I can say for anything I did in the last 10 years. Charlene and I are divorced. She's living with her sister in Ohio, trying to restart her lifestyle curator business. I doubt it'll work. The performance only works when there's money behind it. I'm not writing to apologize. Apologies are just more performance, and I'm done performing. I'm writing to tell you something I should have said when David was alive. You scared me. Not because you were mean or aggressive or any of the things Charlene accused you of. You scared me because you were competent. Because you saw through deals I thought were clever. Because you caught mistakes I didn't even know I was making. Because every time I tried to impress David with my business acumen, you'd quietly point out the flaw in the contract or the problem with the title search, and suddenly I'd look like an idiot. So I convinced myself you were just helping, that David was the real talent and you were just there, supporting him. It was easier than admitting a woman who worked in silence knew more than I did, with all my networking and performance and bullshit. Charlene felt the same way, though she'd never admit it. You made her feel small just by existing, by being substance instead of performance, by actually building instead of just looking like you were building. We destroyed our lives because we couldn't stand that you were better than us without even trying to be. And that's on us. Not on you, not on David, on us. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even want it. I just wanted you to know that I finally understand what David saw in you. What he'd been trying to protect you from, what he built that fortress to shield. He wasn't protecting you from us taking your money. He was protecting you from us, making you believe you were less than you are. Good luck with the scholarship. I read about the first recipient, 42-year-old paralegal with 3 kids. Invisible work finally being recognized. That's your real empire, isn't it? Not the properties, not the money. The empire is showing other people they matter. David would be proud. I hope someday I can build something even a fraction as meaningful. Richard Vance. Margaret read the email twice. Then she closed her laptop and stared out the window at the grey January sky. Bad news? Elena asked, setting down tea. No, Margaret said slowly. Just unexpected news. Richard wrote to me. From Florida. He's working at a car dealership. Let me guess, Elena said dryly. He wants money. No, he wants... Margaret searched for the word. Absolution? Understanding? I don't know. He said I scared him, that I made him feel incompetent. Good, Elena said. He was incompetent. But he finally admitted it, Margaret pointed out. That takes something. Not courage exactly, but something. Are you going to write back? Margaret thought about it. About Richard in his black turtlenecks and his leased Tesla and his crypto gambling. About the man who demanded her pension because he couldn't admit he'd lost everything through his own recklessness. "No," she said finally. "Not because I'm angry, but because he's right. Apologies are performance. If he wants to build something meaningful, he doesn't need my permission or my forgiveness. He just needs to do the work. In silence. The way I did for 35 years. Elena raised her thermos. To silent work. And to people finally shutting up long enough to do it. Margaret smiled, clinked her mug against Elena's thermos. Her phone rang. Brandon. "Aunt Maggie, are you watching the news? Channel 8? "No, why?" "Turn it on. Now." Margaret fumbled for the remote, turned on the small TV she'd bought for the apartment. Channel 8 was running a story about real estate fraud in Connecticut, specifically about landlords who'd been illegally raising rents on properties they didn't actually own. And there, in the lower third of the screen, Sullivan Property Holdings sues 3 property management companies for fraud. The reporter's voice. Representing Margaret Sullivan, the widow whose story captured national attention last month, has filed civil suits against 3 property management companies that allegedly embezzled over $2 million from properties they were managing on behalf of Sullivan Property Holdings. Margaret stared at the screen. "Brandon, what is this?" "It's justice," Brandon said. "Remember those property management companies that handled rent collection for the trust? Turns out they were skimming. Had been for years. I found it when I was doing the audit David requested in the trust documents. They thought no one was paying attention because David was dead and you didn't know you owned anything. They were wrong. $2 million, Margaret whispered. 2.4 million, actually. And we're getting it back. Every cent. Plus damages, plus their business licenses revoked. These companies had been doing this to other property owners too, widows, elderly landlords, anyone they thought wasn't paying attention. You taking them down is going to help a lot of people." After she hung up, Margaret sat in silence. Elena had moved to the window, looking out at Riverside spread below them. "This is what David meant," Margaret said finally, "when he said I was the architect. He didn't just mean I built the properties, he meant I built a system, a foundation, and now that foundation is helping people I've never met, people who were being robbed because no one was paying attention to the details." "You paid attention," Elena said simply. "For 35 years you paid attention, and now the people who thought no one was watching are being held accountable." Margaret thought about the property management companies, about how many other widows, other elderly people, other vulnerable property owners had been targeted, about how her story, the article, the scholarship, the public revelation of her empire, had shone a light into corners where corruption thrived in darkness. The invisible woman becoming visible had made it impossible for others to remain invisible too. That was the ripple effect, not just her own vindication, but the cascading consequences of truth being told, of work being recognized, of foundations being revealed. That evening, Mrs. Chen called from Birchwood Drive. "Margaret, I saw the news. Those terrible management companies. I'm so glad you're getting your money back." "Thank you, Mrs. Chen. And I wanted to tell you, the young couple who bought your house, they're lovely. The wife came by yesterday with cookies to introduce herself to the neighbors. She said you told her about the beveled glass window, about how it makes rainbows in the afternoon. She wanted to know if you knew who installed it." Margaret smiled. "I did. I installed it 40 years ago. She wants to send you a photo, when the afternoon light hits just right. She says her baby is due in March, and she wants the child's first photo to be in those rainbows. A beginning in the house where you and David began." After they hung up, Margaret stood at her own window, watching the January twilight turn Riverside gold and grey. Somewhere in that town, in the house on Birchwood Drive, a young couple was building their beginning in the space where she'd built hers. The foundation remained. The beveled glass window still cast its rainbows. The work she'd done 40 years ago still mattered, still created beauty, still sheltered new life. That was the real empire. Not the money, though the money helped. Not the properties, though the properties provided. But the foundations, the invisible infrastructure. The work done in silence that held everything else up. Her phone buzzed with a text from Taylor Morrison. "Mrs. Sullivan, I just got my spring semester schedule. Constitutional law, property law, legal writing. I start in 3 weeks. My kids made me a sign for my desk. Mum is going to be a lawyer. I'm crying in the grocery store. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for remembering what invisible feels like. I won't forget." Taylor Margaret wrote back, "You were never invisible, Taylor. You were just waiting for the right light. Shine bright." Margaret. She set down her phone and returned to her desk, pulled up the trust documents, started reviewing the next property acquisition Brandon had flagged for her approval. A small commercial building in New Haven that needed work but had good bones. Good bones, that's what David used to say. "This one has good bones, Maggie. What do you think?" And she would pull the title history, research the neighborhood trends, calculate the potential return, and tell him, "The bones are solid. The foundation will hold." She was still doing that work, still analyzing, still building. The difference was, now everyone knew her name. Now the signature on the documents was visible. Now the architect was credited for the architecture. Elena appeared in the doorway of Margaret's office. "I'm heading home. You good?" "I'm good," Margaret said, and meant it. "Still planning on Rome next month?" "Next month," Margaret confirmed. 3 weeks. I'm going to walk the streets David walked, eat at the restaurants he chose, see the city through his eyes and then through mine." "He'd like that," Elena said. "He would," Margaret agreed. "He always said I needed to travel more, to see things outside of Riverside, to remember the world was bigger than property deeds and title searches." But you loved property deeds and title searches." "I did. I do. But I loved David more. And he loved me enough to spend 15 years planning a trip he never got to take, just so I'd have somewhere to go when he was gone, just so I'd remember there was a world outside my grief." Eleanor nodded. "That's love, the kind that plans ahead, the kind that builds, the kind that leaves evidence," Margaret added. "Evidence that we mattered to each other, that we built something real." After Elena left, Margaret worked for another hour, reviewing documents, approving repairs, corresponding with Brandon about legal filings, the ordinary work of managing a real estate empire that generated $86,000 a month. At 8 p.m., she closed her laptop, made herself dinner, nothing fancy, just pasta, and the jar of sauce Elena had insisted she keep in her pantry, ate it at her desk while watching the lights come on across Riverside. Her phone buzzed one more time. A notification from the Scholarship Fund's website. 5 new applications submitted today. She opened them one by one, read the essays, each one a story of invisible work, of women who'd built in silence, of people who'd been told they were too late, too old, too far behind. One application was from a 67-year-old grandmother who'd been a legal secretary for 40 years and wanted to practice law before I'm too old to remember why I started. Margaret smiled and flagged the application for Brandon to review. "You're not too old," she thought. "You're exactly on time." Outside her window, Riverside continued its evening rhythm. Cars heading home, lights in windows, families gathering for dinner. The ordinary machinery of life that ground on regardless of who was being crushed beneath its wheels. But tonight, Margaret wasn't being crushed. Tonight, she was building, brick by brick, in silence no longer, with her name on every foundation, and with evidence everywhere that invisible work had value, that she had value, that the fortress wasn't just protecting her anymore. It was sheltering everyone who came after. That was David's final gift. Not money, not properties, but proof. Proof that love continued past death. Proof that foundations held even when the builders were gone. Proof that the best architecture was the kind that sheltered people who didn't even know they needed shelter yet. Margaret Sullivan, widow and millionaire and architect of everything, turned off her desk lamp and went to bed. Tomorrow, she'd keep building. But tonight, she rested. In the fortress she'd built. In the peace she'd earned, in the light of her own visibility at last. 3 years later, Margaret stood in the arrivals terminal of Bradley International Airport, holding a sign that read, Taylor Morrison ESQ, in bold letters. Around her, families reunited, business travelers rushed past, and the ordinary chaos of homecoming swirled in fluorescent-lit chaos. She'd turned 61 2 weeks ago. Her hair was fully grey now. She'd stopped colouring it somewhere between year 2 and year 3 of her new life, deciding that visibility meant being seen as she actually was, not as the world expected her to be. The arthritis in her hands was worse on cold days, but manageable. She'd learned to ask for help when she needed it, which turned out to be its own kind of strength. Taylor emerged from the security checkpoint wearing a business suit and carrying a leather briefcase that looked well used. Her 3 children trailed behind her, the youngest now 15, the oldest 20, all of them pulling luggage and looking exhausted from travel. When Taylor saw Margaret, her face transformed. She dropped her briefcase and ran across the terminal to throw her arms around the older woman. "I passed," Taylor sobbed into Margaret's shoulder. "I passed the bar, on the first try. I'm a lawyer. I'm actually a lawyer." "I never doubted it for a second," Margaret said, though her voice was thick with tears too. Taylor pulled back, wiping her eyes. "I'm sorry, I'm a mess. We just flew back from California. I took the kids to Disneyland to celebrate. First real vacation we've ever had. And I kept thinking the whole time, this is because of you. This is because you saw me when I was invisible." "No," Margaret corrected gently. "This is because you did the work. I just held open a door you'd been trying to break down for 15 years. You walked through it yourself." Taylor's children approached more cautiously. The oldest, a young woman Margaret remembered as a shy 12-year-old, extended her hand formally. "Mrs. Sullivan, I wanted to thank you. My mum talks about you all the time, about how you showed her that starting late isn't the same as starting wrong. I'm applying to law schools next year, because of what I watched her do. Because of what you made possible." Margaret shook her hand, noting the firm grip, the direct eye contact, the confidence that came from watching your mother transform her life through sheer determination. "Then I expect to see your application for the scholarship," Margaret said. "We've expanded it. It's not just for non-traditional students anymore. It's for anyone who understands that building something real takes time, that invisible work has value. That late is just another word for right on time." They had coffee in the airport cafe. Terrible coffee, overpriced and burnt. But it didn't matter because the conversation was good. Taylor told her about law school, about the late nights and the doubt and the moment in her second year when she'd almost quit. "There was this professor," Taylor said, "constitutional law. He kept calling on me, asking me questions I wasn't prepared for, making me look stupid in front of the whole class. And one day, after class, he asked me why I was wasting everyone's time, said I was too old, too far behind, that I should quit before I embarrassed myself further." Margaret's hands tightened around her coffee cup. "What did you do?" "I went to the bathroom and cried for 20 minutes, Taylor admitted. "Then I called you. Remember? It was like 2 in the morning. Margaret did remember. She'd been in Rome at the time. Her 3rd trip in 3 years, each one longer than the last, each one feeling more like coming home. She'd answered her phone in the dark of her hotel room and listened to Taylor sob about professors who saw age as disqualification instead of experience. "You told me something I've never forgotten," Taylor continued. "You said, he's not trying to make you quit because you're failing. He's trying to make you quit because you're succeeding, and he can't stand that his assumptions about you were wrong. You were right. I graduated top of my class. And that professor, he wrote me a letter of recommendation, never apologized, but the recommendation was glowing. Turns out I'd made him rethink everything he believed about non-traditional students." "Good," Margaret said simply. "The world needs more people whose assumptions get proven wrong." Taylor's youngest, a 15-year-old boy with his mother's eyes, spoke up shyly. "Mrs. Sullivan, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Mum says you worked for like 35 years and nobody knew you were building something important. How did you not get angry? How did you not, I don't know, quit?" Margaret considered the question. It was a good one, an honest one. "I did get angry," she said. "Sometimes I got so angry I couldn't sleep, especially after my husband died, when his family acted like I'd contributed nothing, like I'd just been along for the ride. But here's what I learned. Anger is useful if it shows you what matters, if it reminds you what you've built and who tried to take it. But anger becomes poison if you let it replace the work." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I could have spent the last 3 years being angry at my sister-in-law, at my nephew who stayed silent, at everyone who made me feel invisible. Or I could spend those years building something bigger, something that helped other invisible people become visible. I chose building, because that's what I've always done, that's what I'm good at." The boy nodded slowly. "That makes sense. Thanks." After they parted ways, Taylor and her children heading home to New Haven, Margaret returning to Riverside. Margaret sat in her car in the parking garage and allowed herself a moment of pure satisfaction. 3 years ago, she'd been serving oatmeal in a hospital basement, believing she had nothing. Now, she was watching the first scholarship recipient pass the bar exam and start her own practice. Now, she was inspiring that woman's daughter to follow in her footsteps. Now, she was creating ripples that extended beyond her own vindication into something larger. That was the legacy David had given her. Not just money, not just properties, but the foundation on which other people could build their own empires. The drive from the airport to Riverside took 40 minutes. Margaret used the time to return phone calls. There were always phone calls now. Brandon, updating her on the property management fraud case. They'd recovered all $2.4 million plus damages. Elena, reminding her about dinner tomorrow night. Mrs. Chen, inviting her to a neighborhood potluck, and one call from a number she didn't recognize but answered anyway, because you never knew who might be on the other end. "Mrs. Sullivan?" A young woman's voice, nervous but determined. "My name is Jessica Vance. I'm Charlene and Richard's daughter. Your niece, sort of. I don't know if you remember me." Margaret pulled over into a gas station parking lot, turned off the car. "I remember you, Jessica. You were 14 the last time I saw you, at a family Christmas. That was, 5 years ago?" "6, Jessica said, "before Uncle David died, before everything happened. Mrs. Sullivan, I know I have no right to call you. I know what my parents did. I've read the articles, I've seen the court documents, I know everything, and I'm not calling to make excuses or to ask you to forgive them or anything like that." "Then why are you calling?" Margaret asked, not unkindly. "Because I'm 20, and I'm trying to figure out who I want to be, and I realized I don't want to be like them. I don't want to perform my life. I don't want to live on credit, financial or moral. I want to build something real, something that matters. And I don't know how to do that." Jessica's voice cracked. "My parents lost everything. We lost the house, the cars, everything. Mom's living with her sister, trying to sell essential oils on Instagram. Dad's in Florida selling Hondas. And I'm in community college, working at Target, trying to figure out how to pay for the rest of my education. And I keep thinking about you, about how you worked in silence for 35 years and built an empire nobody knew about. How you were the foundation, but everyone only saw the face." "What are you studying?" Margaret asked. "Business. But I don't know if that's right. I don't know if I'm doing it because I want to or because I'm trying to fix what my parents broke. I don't know anything except that I don't want to be them." Margaret closed her eyes, thought about Charlene's brittle rage and Richard's desperate performance. Thought about Jessica at 14, watching her parents live beyond their means and perform wealth they didn't have. "Can you meet me for coffee?" Margaret asked. "Tomorrow. There's a diner in Riverside. Same one where your Uncle David proposed to me 43 years ago. The coffee's terrible, but the conversation might be worth it." "Really?" Jessica's voice was small. "You'd do that? After everything? You're not your parents, Jessica. You're just a 20-year-old trying to figure out how to build a life. That's not a crime. That's just being 20. They agreed to meet at 10 a.m. the next day. After hanging up, Margaret sat in her car and watched people pump gas, buy lottery tickets, grab coffee for their commutes, the ordinary machinery of life that ground on regardless. She thought about grudges, about how easy it would be to refuse Jessica's call, to let Charlene's daughter figure things out alone as punishment for what Charlene had done. But that wasn't building. That was just continuing the cycle. David had built Margaret a fortress to protect her from people who would diminish her, but he'd also taught her, through his actions, through his planning, through his love, that the point of protection wasn't isolation. The point of protection was having the safety to extend yourself, to help others, to build foundations for people who came after. Jessica Vance wasn't responsible for her parents' choices. She was just a kid trying not to repeat their mistakes. And Margaret Sullivan, who'd spent 35 years being invisible only to discover she'd built an empire, knew something about mistakes and second chances. The next morning, Margaret arrived at the diner early. The same booth she always chose, third from the left, window view of Main Street. The same terrible coffee. The same vinyl seats that had been old when she and David were young. Jessica arrived exactly on time, looking nervous and underdressed for November. Just a thin jacket, cheap sneakers, the uniform of someone trying to make ends meet. She had Charlene's bone structure but Richard's eyes, and something in her expression that suggested she'd learned to expect disappointment. "Thank you for meeting me," Jessica said, sliding into the booth. "I wasn't sure you'd actually show up." "I said I would," Margaret replied simply. "So I did." They ordered coffee, terrible as promised, and Jessica talked about community college and working retail, and living with 3 roommates in an apartment that smelled like mold, about watching her parents' marriage disintegrate, about the shame of having your family's financial abuse become public knowledge. "Everyone at school knows," Jessica said quietly. "They read the articles. They know my mum tried to steal your pension, tried to evict you from your own house. Some people think it's funny. Some people think I'm just like her, that I'm trying to scam you right now by pretending to be sorry." "Are you?" Margaret asked. "Trying to scam me?" "No." Jessica looked horrified. "No, I just want advice. I want to know how you did it. How you built something real when everyone was looking past you. How you stayed patient for 35 years. How you knew the work mattered even when nobody noticed." Margaret sipped her terrible coffee and thought about how to answer honestly. "The truth is, I didn't always know it mattered," she said. "For 18 months after David died, I believed I'd done nothing. I believed I was just his helper, his assistant, his support staff. I believed everything your mother told me, that I was living on charity, that I owed the family, that I had nothing of my own." "But you did have something," Jessica said. "You had everything." "I did, but I'd forgotten, because invisible work becomes invisible even to the person doing it. You do it for so long without recognition that you stop recognizing it yourself. You start believing the story everyone else tells about you." She set down her coffee cup. "Here's what I learned, Jessica. Building something real means doing work that matters even when nobody's watching. It means keeping the records, paying attention to the details, showing up consistently. It's not glamorous, it's not Instagram-worthy, it's just work. But that work compounds, it builds on itself, and eventually the foundation you've been laying in silence becomes visible." "How long does it take?" Jessica asked. "For me, 35 years. For you, maybe less, maybe more. The timeline doesn't matter. What matters is that you're building instead of performing, creating instead of pretending, doing the work instead of talking about doing the work." Jessica nodded slowly. "Mum was always talking about her boutique, like it was this huge success. But I'd see the bills. I'd hear Dad on the phone with creditors. They were performing success while drowning in debt, and I thought that was just how adults were, that everyone was pretending." "Some people are," Margaret acknowledged. "But not everyone. Some people are actually building. You just can't always tell from the outside because the building happens quietly, in spreadsheets and filing rooms and late-night calculations that nobody sees." She paused. "Your Uncle David used to say The foundation is the most important part of the building, but nobody takes pictures of it. He was right. Nobody photographs concrete and rebar. They photograph the finished building, the pretty parts, the performance. But without the foundation, the pretty parts collapse. So what should I do? Jessica asked. How do I build a foundation? What are you good at? Margaret asked. I don't know. Numbers, I guess. Analysis. I'm good at seeing patterns, at figuring out what's actually happening versus what people claim is happening. When I was in high school, I was the one who balanced the student council budget because the president kept making promises we couldn't afford. I'm good at the boring stuff. Margaret smiled. The boring stuff is the most important stuff. That's where all the real work happens. Jessica, if you're good at numbers and analysis, you don't need to study business. You need to study accounting, or finance, or forensic accounting. The fields where being good at boring details is actually valued. But those aren't prestigious, Jessica protested. They're not performative, Margaret finished. Exactly. They're foundational. They're infrastructure. They're invisible until something goes wrong and everyone realizes how much they depended on that invisible work. She leaned forward. Jessica, your parents performed wealth and lost everything. I built wealth in silence and discovered I'd been a millionaire for 20 years without knowing it. Which approach do you think is more sustainable? Jessica laughed, a small, surprised sound. Okay, point taken. But Mrs. Sullivan, I can't afford accounting school. I can barely afford community college. I work 30 hours a week at Target just to make rent. There are scholarships, Margaret said. The one I established is for law students, but there are others. For accounting, for finance, for all the fields where detail-oriented people build foundations. And Jessica? She waited until the young woman met her eyes. If you decide you want to pursue forensic accounting, you call me. I know someone who's very good at it, someone who might be willing to mentor you. Elena? Jessica guessed. Elena, Margaret confirmed. She's 66 now, working part-time at the hospital cafeteria because she likes the routine and the people. But she was one of the best forensic accountants in the country before she exposed her own firm's corruption and got blacklisted. She knows what it's like to do the right thing and pay for it. She'd understand your situation. Jessica's eyes filled with tears. Why are you helping me after what my parents did to you? Because you're not your parents, Margaret said simply, and because someone helped me when I needed it. Elena sat with me in that cafeteria and recognized that I was more than I appeared to be. She taught me that invisible work has value, that keeping the records means holding the power, that foundations matter even when nobody photographs them. She reached across the table and squeezed Jessica's hand, her arthritic fingers aching slightly from the cold, but strong enough for this. You want to know how to build something real, Jessica? Start small. Do the boring work. Pay attention to the details everyone else ignores. Keep the records. Show up consistently. And 30 years from now, you'll look back and realize you built something that matters, something that lasts, something that's real instead of performed. 30 years, Jessica repeated. That's a long time. It goes faster than you think, Margaret said. Trust me. After Jessica left, promising to call Eleanor, promising to research accounting programs, promising to stop trying to fix her parents and start building her own foundation, Margaret sat alone in the diner booth and finished her terrible coffee. Her phone buzzed with a text from Brandon. Closing on the New Haven property today. Want to be there for the signing? She texted back. Wouldn't miss it. Another text, this one from Taylor Morrison. First client meeting tomorrow. Business owner who needs help with contract negotiation. Wish me luck, Margaret replied. You don't need luck. You have preparation. Go show them what 30 years of invisible paralegal work taught you. The waitress refilled her coffee without being asked, a regular's privilege earned through years of consistent Tuesday morning visits to this same booth. Anything else, Mrs. Sullivan? No, thank you, Denise. Just the coffee. Denise hesitated. I read that article about you, the one from a few years back, about how you built all those properties and nobody knew. I just wanted to say, I get it. I've been waitressing here for 23 years, started when I was 19. And sometimes I feel invisible too, like I'm just part of the furniture. But then I think about you, about how you kept working even when nobody noticed, and I think maybe being part of the furniture isn't so bad. Maybe being the foundation of something matters even if nobody takes pictures of it. Margaret smiled. You're not invisible, Denise. You're essential. This diner works because you make it work. That's not nothing. That's everything. He said. After Denise left, Margaret pulled out her phone and opened her photos, scrolled back through 3 years of images. Rome, the streets David had walked, the restaurants he'd chosen, the view from the Hotel Hassler, Taylor Morrison's graduation from law school, Elena's retirement party from the cafeteria, attended by half the hospital staff, Brandon's wedding to a fellow lawyer he'd met while working on the property fraud case, and dozens of photos of ordinary moments. Coffee at this diner, sunsets from her apartment window, the scholarship recipients, 12 so far, all of them non-traditional students, all of them building foundations in silence. The legacy wasn't just hers anymore. It was spreading. Every person she helped, every foundation she supported, every invisible worker she made visible, they all became part of the architecture. They all added their own bricks to the fortress. David had protected her so she could protect others. And those others would protect the ones who came after them. That was how foundations worked. They held everything up, even after the original builders were gone. Margaret paid for her coffee, leaving a generous tip. Because Denise was right, waitresses were infrastructure, and walked out into the November morning. Riverside looked the same as it always had. The same streets, the same storefronts, the same ordinary beauty of a small Connecticut town where nothing dramatic ever seemed to happen. But Margaret knew better now. Everything dramatic happened here, everything important, all the invisible work that held the world together. It just happened quietly, in filing rooms and cafeteria kitchens and late-night calculations, in widows discovering they'd built empires, in scholarship recipients passing bar exams, in 20-year-olds deciding to be better than their parents, in foundations laid brick by brick by brick. Margaret Sullivan walked to her car, her arthritic hands fishing for her keys, her grey hair catching the November sunlight, her posture straight despite 61 years of carrying the world. She had a property closing to attend in New Haven. She had a scholarship committee meeting next week. She had dinner with Elena tomorrow night. She had a life to build. Still, always, because that's what architects did. They built, in silence no longer, with their names on every foundation, with evidence everywhere that invisible work mattered, that she mattered, that the fortress wasn't just protecting her anymore. It was sheltering everyone who needed to learn that foundations mattered more than facades, that substance outlasted performance, that the people who kept the records held the power, even if they didn't know it yet. David had loved her enough to show her what she couldn't see. Now Margaret loved the world enough to show others what they couldn't see in themselves. That was the legacy. That was the empire. That was the architecture of love, extending past death, past grief, past invisibility, into something eternal, something that would outlast them all. One foundation at a time, one brick at a time, one invisible worker made visible at a time. Margaret drove toward New Haven, toward the property closing, toward the next thing she would build. The fortress held, and she lived in it, finally, fully, forever. 5 years later, the David Sullivan Memorial Scholarship Fund awarded its 50th scholarship on a cold morning in March. The recipient was a 63-year-old grandmother who'd worked as a legal secretary for 42 years and wanted to practice law before I'm too old to know why I started. Margaret Sullivan, now 66, handed her the certificate in the same library where she'd met David 48 years earlier. "You're not too old," Margaret told her. "You're exactly on time." As in the audience, Taylor Morrison, Esquire, now running her own practice with 3 associate lawyers, Brandon Sullivan, managing partner of Sullivan Legal Services, Elena Pack, retired forensic accountant and volunteer mentor to 12 students. Jessica Vance, CPA, working in forensic accounting and helping expose financial elder abuse across Connecticut. And in Margaret's pocket, a photo from Rome, taken on her most recent trip. Not of landmarks or monuments, but of a small plaque on a bridge over the Tiber River where someone, maybe David, maybe just a romantic stranger, had written in marker, "The invisible work holds everything up. Remember that." Margaret touched the photo through the fabric of her pocket and smiled. She remembered. She would always remember, and because she remembered, so would everyone who came after. That was the fortress. That was the legacy. That was love, made visible at last.